No. Annie screamed when the police officer tried to tell her why he was there. Arnold was suddenly there beside her, put his arms around her, and looked at the officer with a blank face. What happened? Your father was in a car accident. The police officer said. He was reported to be drinking at a bar, apparently a lot, and 911 was called when he drove away and his car swerved all over the road. He crashed. Arnold said, and the officer nodded. The car was found at the bottom of a ravine and wrapped around a tree. The officer said and explained where the car was found by giving the street and road names to get there from the bar and also the name of the ravine. He saw the confusion on the boy's face and knew he didn't know what he was talking about. In actuality, Arnold didn't know the names and was wondering about the electric sign in the bus. If the bus had driven me out there, would the sign have shown me the same names? What about my father? Arnold asked. The officer looked at the sobbing woman that clung to the young man and sighed. I'm sorry. He didn't make it. What didn't he make? Arnold asked, confused. The officer blinked his eyes for a moment. He passed. Passed? Arnold looked at the officer like he was stupid. His father didn't go to school. The officer looked at the confused young man holding the crying woman, then saw a young woman behind them. Miss, could you? I'll tell him. Heather said. She was on the verge of tears herself and held them back by sheer force of will. The officer let out a sigh. I'm terribly sorry for your loss. He said and walked away. He climbed into his squad car and drove away. Heather walked around Arnold and his mother and shut the door. Arnold, your father, he's dead. Annie let out a loud wail and gripped her son tightly. Arnold stood there and closed his eyes. My father won't hurt my mom anymore. He thought and sighed. He felt a soft hand touch the side of his face and opened his eyes. I'm so sorry. Heather said and leaned in to give him a tender kiss on the lips, then stood there and waited for a break in Annie's crying before she spoke again. You should take your mom to her room. Arnold nodded and adjusted his hold on his sobbing mother, then slowly walked her up the stairs. She held on and didn't let go, even when he sat her down on her bed. Hey Arnold, don't leave. Annie said between hiccups, sobs, and hysterical crying. Don't worry, Mom. Arnold said and sat beside her. I'm not going anywhere. Heather stepped into the doorway and saw Arnold's mother holding on to her son as if he was the only thing she had in the world. I should go. She mouthed the words to Arnold, then she made a telephone motion towards her ear. Call me later. Arnold nodded that he understood. Heather gave him a little wave and left. She waited until she was out in the yard before she took out her cell phone and called her mother for a drive. So early? Her mother asked. What happened? Heather told her that the police were just there and said that Arnold's father had died in a car crash. Oh, that poor boy. Her mother said, sadly. I assume he's taking care of his mother right now. He is. Heather said. I said I was sorry and gave him a kiss, then I didn't know what else to do. That's all right. Her mother said. All you could really do is stand around awkwardly and wait, so leaving was a good choice. Heather relaxed, because she kind of felt like a coward for leaving so quickly. I'll be right there to pick you up. Her mother said. See you soon. Thanks, Mom. Heather said and hung up. She turned around and looked up at the second-story window and sighed. She really didn't know what to do to comfort someone when they lost a parent. Her own father had left before she was born and she didn't have to deal with that kind of loss. She hadn't realized that she lost track of time until a car pulled up and stopped in the street. She turned to see her mother and went over to the car. Rather than get in the back like usual, she climbed into the front. Heather? Her mother asked, slightly worried, then Heather hugged her. It's okay, sweetie. I don't know what to do. Heather said, and tears came to her eyes. There's not really anything you can do, except be there for the people you care about. Her mother said. Arnold was supposed to come over tonight to visit, but, with this happening, there's no way that he can. She said. Why don't you invite him and his mother over tomorrow? Tomorrow? Heather let her mother go and looked at her with surprise. His father just died. Yes, and they are going to be mourning him in that big empty house all night. Her mother said. Believe me, they will jump at the chance to get out and visit us. Are you sure? Heather asked and wiped at her eyes. I only just met his mother. If you don't want to make the offer yourself, I'll call Arnold tomorrow afternoon before you get out of school, then I'll make a round trip and pick all three of you up. Heather thought about it for a minute, then nodded. Thanks, Mom. Her mother put the car in gear and drove down the road. Heather was quiet for a while, then she realized where she was. Being in the front is awkward. Her mother let out a laugh. Spoiled brat. She said. Making me chauffeur you everywhere. I learned from the best. Heather countered, then they both laughed. It was a slightly awkward laugh, though. Arnold stayed with his mother until she calmed down, then he tried to stand up and she held on to him. Don't go. Annie said. You need to eat. Arnold said. I'll be right back up. Annie reluctantly let him go and he was out of the room and downstairs before she had blinked her eyes twice. Her anxiety rose and she started to shake, then she heard the microwave started and waited desperately for it to finish and for her son to return. She didn't relax until she saw his face and then she let out the breath she didn't realize she was holding. It's hot. Arnold said and handed her the plate. Annie nodded and stirred it, then tried to eat. Her eyes teared up when the spoon touched her lips, because she realized she was never going to share a meal with the man she loved. She started crying again and dropped the spoon onto the plate and bent her head down and let the tears flow. Tell me what you want me to do. Arnold said, and that made her cry harder. Annie wasn't sure if she could do it anymore. Arnold needed her almost constantly and that was a strain at the best of times. She handled Arnold well when she knew that his father was close by if she needed him. Now, with her husband gone, she had no support at all. Either physically or financially, she was bereft of any means. Also, besides the money from Arnold's college account, which she would have to spend a lot of if she wanted to keep the bill collectors at bay, she had nothing. No job, no paycheck, and no source of income at all. Arnold, oh God. Annie sobbed and put the plate of food aside and covered her face with her hands. What are we going to do now? She asked, rhetorically. Arnold didn't know what was wrong. He had gotten rid of his father because he had hurt his mother and took all that money and hurt her again. With him gone, all of that should have gone away. He had no idea what to do to help his mother now, except for one thing. Arnold copied a technique he learned from some bullies and pinched her arm. Ow! Annie yelled and jerked her arm away. Do you like that? Arnold asked and pinched her leg. Ow! Annie yelled again and slapped his hand. Stop that. Come on, do you like it or not? Arnold asked and pinched her ear. Arnold! Annie yelled at the top of her lungs and stood up. So help me God, if you don't stop right this second. Are you angry now? Arnold asked and feigned a pinch to her arm and then reached down and pinched her belly instead. Stop it, Arnold. Annie hollered as she hauled her hand back and then slapped him across the face as hard as she could. What are you doing? I'm making you angry, Mom. Arnold said and ignored his throbbing face as he tried to pinch her arm. Annie blocked his effort and he tried her other arm and was blocked as well. Dad's gone and crying won't bring him back. Arnold said and tried to pinch her thigh. Annie smacked his hand so hard that his fingers tingled. You aren't this weak, Mom. Arnold reached for her face and she grabbed his wrist with both of her hands to stop him, and he let her. That's better. Annie had never seen her son act like this and she was shocked that he would treat her this way. Suddenly, he yanked his trapped hand back and out of what she thought was the vice-like grip she had on it. Instead of hitting her like she expected, when his hand darted back in, he stopped beside her face and rested his hand against her cheek. "I'll never hurt you, Mom," Arnold said. "Arnold, do you know how much pinching hurts?" Annie asked angrily and pushed his hand away. "I've been pinched a lot like that, so yes," Arnold said to her surprise. "It's only temporary pain," he said. "I did it to get your attention." "Well, you have it," Annie said, anger still in her voice, even though she was already calming down. "Dad's gone," Arnold said. "He's not coming back," he said and saw his mother's face lose its anger. "You need to be strong," he said and reached out to pinch her again. "Pinching me isn't going to make me stronger," Annie said and batted his hand away. "It already has," Arnold said and lifted the hand she had smacked hard. A large welt was on the back of it and she caught her breath. "Hey Arnold, my face should be a nice color tomorrow," Arnold said. Annie looked at his face and saw a similar shaped welt there. "Arnold. I'm sorry." "It's okay, Mom. I made you do it," Arnold said. Tears came to his mother's eyes, so he reached out to pinch her. "Stop!" Annie yelled and pushed his hand away. Her tears over hurting him were instantly forgotten. "Every time you cry over this, I'll pinch you," Arnold warned her. "You won't be here all the time," Annie said and surprised herself. "I'm suspended for 2 weeks," Arnold reminded her, which meant he wasn't going to be leaving the house at all during that time. Annie closed her eyes and sighed, then opened them and stared at her son, who had a hand poised to pinch her belly. "I'm not going to cry." "I know you aren't, Mom," Arnold said and let a small smile appear on his face. "Go get changed and go to bed," Annie ordered him. Arnold nodded and went across the hallway and took off his girlfriend clothes and put on a t-shirt and a pair of shorts, then climbed into bed. His mother had watched him the whole time and he turned in the bed to look at her. He raised a hand as if to wave, then made a pinching motion instead. "Ugh!" Annie grunted and almost slammed her bedroom door closed. "The nerve of that kid!" she exclaimed and took off her clothes and put on a similar outfit to her son's, then climbed into bed. As she lay there, she felt all the pinches he had given her. She reached up and rubbed the spot on her arm. He knew the right spot to pinch to cause the most amount of pain with the least amount of damage. She thought. He really has been bullied like that before. Annie's thoughts concentrated on that and she wondered when it had happened to him and who had done it. It didn't occur to her that Arnold has successfully distracted her from her overwhelming grief. She had been a slobbering, depressed mess only half an hour ago, and now she was calmly thinking about other things, mainly why he had not told her about it before. Arnold waited until his mother was asleep before he got out of bed and crept downstairs to the living room and retrieved his backpack and the stack of photos that Heather had made for him. He went back upstairs and went back into his room and got to work. He climbed into bed and memorized all of the specimens, their parts, and their normal and scientific names. His estimate of approximately 10 hours was right on the money as the 10th hour ended and morning came. Arnold got up and went downstairs to the kitchen without getting changed first. He knew he would be tired later because he had stayed up all night, and he was okay with that. He would let Heather know when she came over that he was ready to take the biology teacher's test that he had been studying so hard for. Arnold's mother was in the kitchen making breakfast and she didn't say anything to him. It was the first time that happened, so Arnold sat at the table and stared at her with a blank face. He had no idea why she was ignoring him and knew better than to ask her. She didn't like it when he asked questions like that. Annie ignored his pointed stare, mainly because she didn't want to look at the mark she had left on his face, and she finished making scrambled eggs and toast. She divided them up onto 3 plates and brought them to the table. She set them in the right places and sat down, then she realized what she had done. Her eyes started to tear up, because she had made up a plate for her dead husband, then she felt a strong pinch on her upper arm. Ow! Annie yelled and jerked away from her son's hand. Arnold! Arnold didn't respond and started eating. You can't keep doing that, Annie said, angrily. Arnold still didn't respond and kept eating. His mother sat there and glared at him as he ate. She waited for him to answer her, even though she knew he wouldn't answer unless it was a question. Without saying a word, he reached over and took the 3rd plate and put it on his empty one and kept eating. She was surprised by this, since he never asked for more food and he never ate more than what he was given. Arnold finished the 2nd plate of food, picked up both plates, and took them to the sink. I need to start looking for work, he said as he gave the plates a quick rinse and washed his hands. You don't know how to properly work on a job, Annie said. Arnold turned to look at her as he dried his hands. Can you show me? I can't be with you all day while you're at work to make sure you're doing it right, Arnold, Annie said, then she took in a sharp breath. It was the first time she had said out loud what she had to do for him since he was 6 and started real school after primary. If she hadn't been there that first day to make sure he listened and responded when asked a question, or made him leave the classroom to go outside for recess, or took him to the cafeteria at lunchtime to eat the lunch she had packed for him, he would not have done any of it on his own. Arnold, Annie started to apologize when the telephone rang. She sighed and answered. Hello. She was quiet for a moment. Excuse me. Arnold hung the towel on the rack by the sink and watched his mother. I don't think that's necessary, is it? Annie asked and was quiet for another moment. She blinked her eyes and tried to stop the tears, then Arnold was there and made a pinching motion. She smacked his hand away and then sighed again. All right. I'll be right there. Arnold stood there and waited. That was the police station, Annie said, then couldn't stop the tears before they fell. They want me to identify the body. Arnold reached out and pinched her belly. Arnold! Annie yelled angrily at him and slapped his hand away. She took several breaths to calm down, because feeling instant anger shocked her almost as much as her son making her that angry in the first place. I need to go. I'll get changed, Arnold said and walked around her. You're not going, Annie exclaimed. I don't want him seeing his father in whatever state he's in. Arnold ignored her and grabbed the keys from the counter before he went up the stairs. Since they were going out, he dressed as if he was going out for school, then came back downstairs. Give me my keys, Annie said and held a hand out to him. I'm coming, Arnold said and handed her the keys. Annie didn't say anything and left the house. Arnold was right behind her after he had locked the door, then he waited on the passenger side of the car while she went to the driver's side. Instead of unlocking all of the doors with the keychain button, she used the key in the door and only unlocked hers. Arnold saw this, so he waited for her to get in and turned around. Annie smiled because she had outsmarted him and he would have to stay home now. She started the car and backed out of the driveway, then glanced at the front door of the house, and Arnold wasn't there. She looked around for him and caught her breath as she saw him walking down the street, going in the wrong direction. She pulled the car out of the yard and drove over to him and rolled down her window. Go home, Arnold, Annie said. Arnold didn't respond and kept walking. You're going the wrong way, Annie said, and he stopped walking. She started to smile, because he didn't know where to go, then he turned around and jogged the other way. Damn it, she said loudly and pulled into a driveway, turned the car around, and drove to catch up to him. Arnold. Arnold stopped jogging and slowed to a walk. He didn't know how far he had to go to find a bus stop in this direction, so he had to pace himself. "Why, Arnold?" Annie asked. "Why do you want to go?" "I want to see," Arnold said, then he looked at her with longing in his eyes. "I want to see if he's really dead." Annie took in a sharp breath and let it out, then hit the button to unlock the car doors as she pulled the car to a stop. "Get in." Arnold climbed into the passenger side and Annie drove them towards the police station. Arnold and Annie arrived at the police station and parked in the visitors' parking lot. "Arnold, you don't have to do this," Annie said. "I don't even want to do it myself," she thought. Arnold didn't say anything and got out of the car and waited for her. His mother sighed and got out herself and locked the car, then they walked over to the front doors. The large glass doors opened automatically, as if they were going into a supermarket, and they walked over to the front desk. "What can I do for you?" the man in the uniform behind the desk asked. "I'm Annie Strickland," Annie said. "I'm here to identify." She was about to start crying when Arnold turned and reached for her arm. She put a hand up to stop him and hid her instant anger at her son. "My husband. I'm here for my husband." The officer nodded and picked up a phone and hit a button. "Mrs. Strickland is here." A minute later, a very pretty police officer came over. She was quite tall at just over 6 feet, which seemed out of character for police officers, and her long blonde hair was tied back into a tight bun at the back of her head. She wore minimal makeup that accentuated her cheeks and her eyes. "Hi. I'm Detective Tanner," the woman said and held a hand out for Annie to shake. "Detective?" Annie asked and took the hand. A detective is always assigned when an accident happens. Detective Tanner said and motioned for Annie and Arnold to follow her. "We needed to determine if foul play was involved, even if it's not suspected." "You think, did someone?" Annie's voice trembled as they passed through a set of double doors. "No," Detective Tanner said and stepped close to pat Annie's hand reassuringly. "No, it was an accident. All of the witnesses that saw him leave the bar say so." "I can't believe he was drinking at work," Annie said in disbelief as she walked on one side of the detective and Arnold walked on the other side. "What else was he doing? Having an affair?" "We couldn't find any evidence of an affair," Detective Tanner said and then sighed. "You didn't hear that from me, all right?" Annie nodded and Arnold just stared at her blankly. "Why would you think that?" Arnold asked. Annie gasped and her eyes started to tear up. She was glad that she was too far away for Arnold to reach her, then her tears stopped when she realized she was glad to be away from him. She walked around the detective and put an arm around her son and hugged him. "I'm so sorry, Arnold," Annie said and hugged him. "Here we are," Detective Tanner said and stopped in front of a set of double doors. "I think your son should stay out here." "No," Arnold said. "I need to see." Detective Tanner looked at Annie, who shrugged. "Okay," she said and took them into a small room that had several lockers and cabinets on the side and handed them 2 medical face masks. "What are these for?" Annie asked. "Honestly, it's the smell," Detective Tanner said and put hers on to show them how to do it. Annie and Arnold put them on and she brought them through the next set of double doors. There were 3 tables that were empty and one that had a sheet covering something lumpy underneath it. An unhappy man in a lab coat stood beside the table and glared at the detective. "I didn't think you would bring his whole family to see this." Detective Tanner shrugged. "He insisted on seeing it," she said and waved to Arnold. The man looked at Arnold and saw his cold expression. "I hope you're ready for this." Arnold knew he should respond in some fashion, so he nodded. "I did the best I could on such short notice," the man said and eased the sheet off of the lump closest to them. "Oh God!" Annie yelled and covered her eyes and walked away to the other side of the room while Arnold stared down at the mangled face. A steering wheel combined with a windshield. The man said. It's not pretty. How are we supposed to identify him? Arnold asked. Even he had a hard time seeing his father's features through the mess. That's a good question. The man said and looked at the detective with anger on his face. Apparently the fingerprints, witnesses, and his DNA all over the scene of the accident wasn't enough. They had to drag you poor people down here to see him so you can, miraculously, tell us that it's really him. It's police procedure. Detective Tanner said. The family is supposed to confirm his identity. What if he was burned up or crushed flat? Arnold asked and looked at the detective. Would we still have to come and see him? The man in the lab coat let out a laugh as the detective's face drained of color. Excellent questions, my boy. Excellent. He said and moved the sheet back to cover the mangled face. Would you care to answer him, detective? Detective Tanner knew it was a trap and she couldn't answer in either a positive or a negative way, since both would be bad answers. She decided that silence was her only course of action and took it. As I suspected. The man said and looked at Arnold. So, is this man your father? Those are his clothes. Arnold said and pointed to the innocuous pile of cloth on the desk across the room. I'm pretty sure that the face looked like my dad's before. The man gave Arnold a nod and looked at the detective. I'll accept his confirmation, detective. Detective Tanner had to accept it and motioned for Arnold to leave. He walked over to his mother and put an arm around her shoulders and the detective led them from the room. I'm sorry you had to see that. Detective Tanner said and took off her face mask. No, you aren't. Arnold said and she looked at him with surprise on her face. You kept watching my mom's reactions. I wasn't. Detective Tanner denied it and saw his face grow impassive. The last thing she wanted was an uncooperative witness and she let out another sigh. Ah, damn it. I just thought of a grieving family member as a witness. She looked at the mother, who had drying tears on her face and genuine grief plastered all over it. When they reached the lobby, the detective tried to take them into the precinct. When she opened the door to the main area, a fairly overweight man strode over to her. There's no need to bring them in here. The man said. But, sir. Detective Tanner said. I need to ask them some questions about. I believe you have traumatized them enough for today. The man said and saw how the boy held his mother possessively, then squinted his eyes at the much taller detective. You and I need to have a little talk about proper police procedure. Oh, shit. Detective Tanner thought and sighed. Mrs. Strickland, you and your son can go home. The man said in as nice of a voice as he could. I apologize for you having to go through that. Annie reached up and wiped at her face and nodded. Arnold, let's go. Arnold led them from the room, through the lobby, and out of the building. He took his mother over to the car and she leaned against the driver's side door and didn't open it. Arnold. Annie stood there and thought about what she had just seen and looked at her son. He's gone. She said and closed her eyes. He's really gone. Arnold looked down as he reached out to pinch her before she cried again and he stopped when her hands grabbed his wrists. You don't have to do that anymore. Annie said and he looked up at her face. You're right. I can't afford to cry right now. She let his wrists go and clicked the button to open the car doors. Let's go home. They got in the car and Annie drove them home. They didn't speak and they didn't feel the need to, even when they pulled into the driveway and parked the car, they stayed silent. They went into the house and Annie had Arnold sit at the table. She saw the half-eaten breakfast she had left on the table and cleaned it off and put the plate into the sink with the two Arnold had used. Annie made 3 ham and cheese sandwiches and gave 2 to Arnold and kept 1 for herself. She sat down next to him and they ate together. When the sandwiches were gone, Annie sat there and stared at her son and he stared right back at her. She had no clue what to do with their lives now. She hadn't had a job in almost 20 years and she seriously doubted that she could learn what she needed to work in today's workforce. The phone rang and Annie thought about letting it go as she contemplated what to do, then picked it up instead. Hello. She was quiet for a moment, then sighed. Yes. She said. I don't, well, yes. She said and then sighed. I agree that's important. Arnold sat there and waited to see who it was. That's not necessary. Annie said and looked at Arnold. I suppose. A moment later, she nodded. All right. We'll see you then. She hung up the phone and sighed. Heather's mother is going to pick us up before she goes to the high school to get Heather. What for? Arnold asked. She invited us over to visit and to have supper. Annie said. I need a shower after. She took a breath and let it out. You need to get changed, too. The same as yesterday? Arnold asked. Use a dark color shirt this time. Annie said and they both went up the stairs. Arnold was changed 10 minutes later and grabbed his backpack, since he knew he and Heather had homework to do, and he went downstairs to wait. He thought about listening at his mother's door to see if she was crying, then decided that she would get really angry at him if he went into her room without being asked. Annie came down the stairs half an hour later wearing a nice black blouse and matching skirt. She wasn't surprised to find that her son had waited for her at the bottom of the stairs. She should be here in a few minutes. Arnold said. Annie nodded and stopped in front of him and checked his outfit. She nodded and they both stood there and waited. 2 minutes later, they heard a car pull into their driveway and the horn honked. Arnold opened the door and they both stepped out, and he locked it behind them. Heather's mother got out of the car and walked over to them. It's so nice to meet you in person. She said to Annie and stepped close to give her a hug. I was very sorry to hear what happened. Annie was a bit surprised that a stranger was acting that way with her. Thank you, Claire. Claire let her go and turned to give Arnold a hug, too. Heather has been looking forward to seeing you, Arnold. She said and let him out of the hug. I only have a modest supper broiling in the oven, so it should be done in a couple of hours. She stepped back and smiled. You both look very nice. Annie and Arnold looked at each other, then back at her, and she laughed. Shall we go? Claire asked and walked back over to the car. Arnold got in the back like he had each time he had been in the car, and Annie thought about doing the same, just so she wouldn't have to engage in awkward conversation, then sighed mentally and sat in the front seat. As if she knew what Annie was thinking, Claire reached over and pat her hand. It's okay. You don't have to talk. That's not why I invited you over. Why did you? Annie asked, and didn't realize she had been completely sucked into talking anyway. For Heather and Arnold, of course. Claire said. Their budding relationship is all she can talk about. She chuckled and pulled away from the curb. Arnold this and Arnold that. She said, and the car picked up speed. I think my little girl is deeply in love with him. What? Annie looked at Claire with wide eyes. Claire heard the surprise in her voice and gave her a quick glance, then looked back at the road. Don't get me wrong. Heather's not some wallflower without experience. She's had a couple of boyfriends already. A bit too many for my liking, but that couldn't be helped. I interfered as much as I physically could to stop her antics. She thought in satisfaction, because she had gotten particularly good at it. Then, she really could. Annie's voice trailed off and Claire hid her smile. Yes, she's going to wrap Arnold around her little finger. Claire thought. It's all right. I've talked with her and she's not going to push him to do anything he doesn't want to do. Annie let out a sigh. What if he wants to do things like that, with her? Claire gave Annie another glance and saw the realization of what she said on her face. She's pretty smart to catch on to what I said right away. She thought. I don't leave them alone for too long, either. Annie nodded because she did the same thing. Judiciously interrupting at certain times definitely kept them from pawing at each other like she thought they were going to if she left them alone for too long. Claire drove the car to the high school and pulled into the parking lot. She parked in the same spot she always did, mainly because no one else was there that early. She didn't try to engage Annie in conversation again, mainly because she knew that Heather would be out soon and would interrupt it. Instead, she turned on the radio on low for some background noise. After about 15 minutes, the school bell rang. Barely a minute later, nearly every student in the school was out of the doors in a flood of bodies and spread out to go to different spots. It was a neat sight to see, considering the sheer amount of people and how coordinated it looked. One group in particular caught Claire's eye as they moved across the parking lot to stand in their usual spot. Brad and Kevin's friends. 5 minutes after that, Heather came out of the school with Kelly by her side. They walked over to the parking lot and Heather waved, which meant she didn't want to walk by the group of guys. Claire started the car and drove over to them. See you tomorrow, Heather. Kelly gave her friend a hug, because it had been a hard day for her. Bye, Kelly. Heather said and opened the back door and climbed in beside Arnold. Hi, Arnold. She said and looked at the backs of her mother's and his mother's heads, then leaned in to give Arnold a kiss. She did it for only a moment, then sat back with a slightly red face. Both Claire and Annie had watched them in the rear-view mirror and didn't need to turn around to see what they were doing. Claire gave Annie a smile and drove the car out of the parking lot. How are you, Arnold? Heather asked. What did you do all day? I'm fine. I went to see Dad today. Arnold said. What? Heather yelled, then she blushed and looked at the back of her mother's head to wait for a responding yell from her, which didn't come. She had missed her mother's own slight yell and gasp at the news. I'm sorry. She said and looked back at Arnold and took his hand. Was it awful? It was horrible. Annie said and did her best to hold back the tears and wiped at her eyes to stop them before Arnold saw them. I didn't recognize him. Claire's hand took hers and held it tightly. I'm sorry you had to see that, Annie. Annie turned her head to look at the other woman and saw a lot of sympathy there. Me, too. They drove the rest of the way to Heather's home in silence. They parked in the driveway of the large house and went inside. Claire sent her daughter and Arnold upstairs to do their homework and took Annie into the kitchen for some girl bonding time and to check on supper. She saw the food was coming along nicely and left it in the oven, then she made tea and gave Annie a cup. They sat down at the small kitchen nook and stared at each other. You, too? Annie asked and Claire nodded. Heather thinks he left before she was born. Claire said and took a drink of tea. Why? Annie asked. It was easier than telling her the truth about him being murdered. Claire said with a shrug. Am murdered? Annie asked, surprised. It wasn't like a conspiracy by a best friend, or a business partner, or something else contrived. Claire said. It was just a random act committed in the street, late at night, while he was closing up the store. Annie reached over and took her hand and held it tightly, just like Claire had done for her in the car. Now I know why you really asked me over. Annie said. Claire couldn't help but smile at that. I couldn't have just wanted my daughter to spend time with her boyfriend. Annie smiled back. You would have just asked for him to come over if that was what you wanted. Claire chuckled. I'm trying to secretly comfort you in your time of need and you've already discovered my ulterior motives. Annie nodded and took another drink of tea. This is really good. What is it? It's a specially concocted blend of leaves and water. Claire said. Annie let out a laugh. You know what I meant. Claire walked over to the pantry and came back out with a generic box of tea bags. "Here's the magic secret," she said and tossed the box onto the small table. "You're kidding." Annie looked at the tea bags she bought herself because they were so cheap. "How?" "I cheat and use 2 bags per cup," Claire said. "It brews twice as strong and gives it great flavor." Annie looked at her cup and at the box, then shook her head. "So simple and yet so effective. Stick with me and I'll show you all the tricks you need to live like you're rich with almost no money." Annie opened her mouth to respond, then her eyes teared up. "Oh, God," she said and started crying. "I knew there would be a sore spot that I shouldn't talk about," Claire said and sat down next to her and hugged her. "Now that I know, you might as well tell me all about it." Heather took Arnold upstairs to her room and they put their backpacks on the bed. She had him sit down on the bed and she went back to her door to shut and lock it, then she leaned against it guiltily. "We should start our homework," Arnold said and looked at her small desk that was crowded with the computer, makeup, and a bunch of other little things, then he glanced around the room. "There's not enough room for us to do homework in here." "That's okay," Heather said and slowly walked over to him. "We don't have any homework." Arnold turned and looked at her, and her face was flushed red. Heather put her hands on his shoulders and eased him backwards onto the bed to get him to lay down, then she straddled his waist. She looked at him expectantly, then she bent down and kissed him. He kissed her like she had taught him and she put her hands on his head and rubbed his blonde buzzcut as they made out. Heather rocked her hips and ground herself against him, and she was really glad that she had worn jeans today. She wouldn't have been able to sit across his lap like this if she had a skirt on. She broke the kiss and sat up and didn't stop her hips. She felt something hard grow and she smiled at him. "Heather, what?" Arnold started to ask what she was doing and she covered his mouth. "It's okay," Heather whispered. "We don't have a lot of time, so we can't really do anything." Arnold looked down at her hips and looked back at her face. Heather softly laughed. "I want to do a lot more than this," she whispered and closed her eyes. Her hips went a little faster and she rubbed against him a little harder, then she caught her breath and opened her eyes. "Oh, Arnold." She gasped and bent back down to kiss him again. Her hips eventually stopped moving and she was breathing heavily as she relaxed against him. She broke the kiss and rolled off to lay beside him. Wow," Heather said and tried to slow her breathing. "Are you okay?" Arnold asked and turned his head to look at her. "Yes," Heather said. "I'm more than okay." "You don't sound okay," Arnold said and sat up. "I'm fine, well, I just..." Heather's face flushed a little more red. "I can't say I just came." "Did you hurt yourself?" Arnold asked and reached out and grabbed her between the legs. Heather gasped at the touch and tensed up, since she was still sensitive after rubbing herself through the denim. "You must be sore," Arnold said and looked at it. "I'll rub it," Heather encouraged. "Make it feel better." Arnold gave her a disbelieving look. "Mom always said that you should kiss it and make it feel better." "Oh." Heather went a little again at the thought. Oh, God," she whispered. Would you really do that for me?" Arnold nodded and moved his hand. Heather quickly opened her jeans and slid them down past her hips to reveal her very damp underwear. She sat up and had the jeans off and tossed them aside, then her underwear quickly followed and she laid back down. "It's all red," Arnold said and knew she had hurt herself rubbing on him. Then you better kiss it all over to make it feel better," Heather said, her face completely red as she spread her legs for him. Arnold bent down and kissed her right on her sensitive spot and she clamped her mouth shut to stop from screaming in pleasure. He saw her tense up again and thought it was even more hurt than he assumed, so he kissed it again and again. Heather writhed on the bed as Arnold kissed her all over. It was nice and she liked it, but, it wasn't giving her what she wanted. Kiss it like you kiss me on the lips. Arnold did as she said and Heather was immediately transported into a dream world. She had a guy go down on her before and it was okay. He had stopped after only a minute and she barely got anything out of it. Even the sex afterwards was as bland as the guy's tongue had been. Now she was in heaven, because she never imagined that a guy would do it to her and kept doing it without asking to stop. Mom was right. Arnold thought. It really does leak a lot when you play with it. If Arnold had cared about the taste at all, he would find that it was a bit off, probably because Heather had been sweating in her underwear in class all day. He didn't care though, so he kept kissing and adding the occasional tongue. He really was getting better at kissing and it showed. H-m. Heather covered her own mouth to stop her startled yell as she sat up. Hey, how is the studying going? Claire asked. Arnold sat up and looked at the door. Heather's teaching me a lot. Why yeah. Heather said nervously. He's a quick learner. Supper will be ready soon. Claire said with a smile. If you're done, pack your stuff up and come down to the dining room. We are. Heather said in a normal voice. We'll be right down. They clearly heard her footsteps walk away and Heather collapsed back onto the bed. We almost got caught. Heather said with a laugh and looked up at Arnold. Arnold looked down between her legs and back at her face. Was that fun for you? He asked, wanting to confirm what his mother had said. Arnold, that was the most fun I've ever had, even though we had to stop. Heather said, then she rolled onto her side to look at her jeans on the floor. Her wet underwear had landed on them and had made a huge wet spot. Oh, damn. She said and sighed. If I go downstairs in different clothes, they'll know we were up here doing something. They already know that. Arnold said and Heather gave him a wide-eyed look, then she laughed. Okay, I guess they do. Heather said and stood up, then went over to her bathroom and washed herself up. She came back out and grabbed another pair of underwear and slipped them on, then grabbed a pair of shorts and put them on, too. She looked at Arnold and was a little surprised that he didn't have that leering look she had seen on other guys' faces when they saw something of hers that she normally kept hidden. You're a really nice guy, Arnold. Heather said and pulled off the t-shirt she had on, which left her in just a white bra, then she walked over to her closet and took out a shirt similar to Arnold's. She buttoned it up the same as his and the bottom of the shirt covered the shorts she had on and made it look like she was only wearing the shirt. Casual chic. Arnold said. Heather nodded and held a hand out to him. He took it and she brought him downstairs to the dining room. Her mother and Arnold's mother turned their heads to look at them and saw the different clothes Heather was wearing. Heather? What are you wearing? Claire looked at her daughter's half-naked body. Heather laughed. I'm wearing shorts, Mom. She said and lifted the shirt. They are a lot more comfortable than my jeans. I told you not to buy your exact size. Claire said and shook her head. You know they only fit well on certain days. Heather rolled her eyes and walked Arnold over to the table and sat him beside his mother, then she walked around the table and sat beside her own mother. This surprised both mothers and they exchanged pointed glances, mainly because they had thought she would take the opportunity to stay right beside him. Arnold, your mother and I have been talking. Claire started to say and Heather groaned. Not about you, dear. She said and pat Heather's hand. It was about Arnold needing a job. What? Heather looked at her mother and then at Arnold's mother. Why does he need a? She stopped talking when she remembered what had just happened. What kind of job? She asked, knowing that whatever job it was going to take away nearly all of their time together. We think we can start him with yard work. Claire said. Right here, in fact. Mom. Heather couldn't have heard that right. Arnold will be coming here to work. Her heart beat faster. That's too good to be true. We'll start off small at first. Just the lawnmower and maybe the lawn edger. Claire said. Once he can use them competently, we can try the hedge trimmers and have him tend to the flower beds. Those things are half dead. Heather said before she could stop herself. Ah. I mean, he's got a lot of work to do. Claire chuckled. Don't worry, Heather. I'm not a slave driver and I don't expect miracles to happen. But, well, I suppose if he wants to. Heather looked at Arnold. Do you want to try it? Arnold looked at their expectant faces, especially his mother's. When do I start? All three of them had huge smiles for him and he wondered why him working there got that reaction. I'll pick you up first thing in the morning when I drop Heather off at school. Claire said. We can pick him up on the way. Heather said with a smile. Claire looked across the table at Annie, who shrugged slightly. Okay. It would only be a difference of a few minutes either way, so picking him up first didn't make much difference, except to Heather. She would get to see Arnold first thing in the mornings, even though he wasn't in school. If she was lucky, she would also see him after school, either still working at her house or as her mother dropped him off. Did you get done what you started upstairs? Claire asked. Almost. Heather said and looked at Arnold. If we had a bit more time, I'm sure we could finish up. I don't mind staying for a while longer. Annie said. Claire and I can talk a bit more about things. Claire smiled and nodded. I believe supper should be just about done. She said and left the table to go check. The teachers appreciated you doing your homework, even though you didn't attend classes. Heather said to Arnold. Can you tell the biology teacher I'm ready to take his test? Arnold asked. What test? Heather asked, then she covered her mouth. Don't tell me there's a bio test coming up. Only for me. Arnold said and she relaxed. Remember those pictures you gave me? You memorized them already? Heather asked, surprised. Arnold nodded. He told me to tell him when I was done. Heather's been telling me that you've been doing a lot of extra work for that class. Claire said and brought in a huge oval metal pan that was a foot high and 2 feet long. Annie took in a breath through her nose. It smells good, whatever it is. It's roasted mongoose. Claire said dramatically and pulled off the top of the pan. What? Heather and Annie said at the same time and Claire laughed at their disgusted faces. Arnold stood up to look inside and it didn't look like a mongoose. It's too big to be a mongoose. Claire put the pan lid to the side and nodded. It's actually pork shoulder roast. Ha. Ha. Heather squinted her eyes at her mom. Very funny. It was. Claire said and walked over to a cabinet and grabbed 2 large forks, then came back to the table. When you cook it like this, it just falls apart. She said and dug the 2 forks into it and the meat split apart like nothing was holding it together and she put a good portion onto a plate. There's also potatoes, carrots, turnips, asparagus, broccoli, parsnips, Brussels sprouts, and green beans. You cooked them all together? Annie asked. Well, no. Claire said. They had to be prepped separately and added when their cook times required. She smiled. They would become mush if you cooked them as long as the meat. That's just what I was going to say. Annie said with a laugh. Claire served them and herself and moved the pan down the table, that way it was still accessible and out of the way at the same time. She sat down and they all ate together. She had given them fairly large portions and it took a while for everyone to eat their fill. It looks like we'll be eating leftovers for a while. Claire said with a laugh, because barely a quarter of the roast had been divided up. You don't want it to go to waste. Annie said. No, I don't. Claire said. Why don't you take some of it home with you? What? No, you don't have to do that. Heather's going to be sick of it in a couple of days. Claire said and glanced at Arnold. A growing boy won't complain about getting good food whenever he can. All right. Annie said. She knew Arnold would eat anything she put in front of him, so leftovers wouldn't bother him at all. Why don't you two go back upstairs and finish what you were doing before? Claire said. Annie and I will be in the kitchen and dealing with this thing. She waved at the large pan. Okay. Heather said and stood up, then held a hand out to Arnold. He took it and she led him out of the dining room. Claire covered the large pan and carried it back into the kitchen to divide the food up. Annie followed her and waited until she was sure that the kids were far enough away not to hear her. You do know that they are making out upstairs. Claire chuckled and grabbed a large plastic container. And right under our noses, too. Claire. Annie sighed. I've tried to explain about him. It's all right. Claire said and used the big forks to start transferring the meat into the container. I already promised to keep a close eye on them for the both of us. Annie sighed. He can be so straightforward. Claire said. Annie raised her eyebrows for a moment, then nodded. I know now, so I'll take good care of him. Claire said. If you want, you can come with him tomorrow and see how he's doing. Annie thought back to what she had said to Arnold about not being able to be there all day while he worked, and shook her head. She needed to see if he could do it without her help. I'm sorry that I'm trusting you with so much. Annie said. Claire put the forks down and put her hands on the other woman's shoulders. I know we just met, but I hope we are going to be good friends. She said. As your friend, I promise that I won't let anything bad happen to your son. Annie took a deep breath and let it out, then nodded. Claire smiled and let her go, then picked up the forks. You know, I really hate Brussels sprouts. Annie smiled and looked into the pan. Why did you cook so many? I didn't want to be the only one to suffer with the awful taste. Claire said, then both women laughed. Heather once again led Arnold to her room, then put him inside and turned to shut the door. Do you want me to kiss it again and make it feel better? Arnold asked. Heather leaned her forehead against the now closed door and took a deep breath and let it out. I really want him to. She thought with a smile, then she turned around to look at him. Arnold, Her eyes dropped down to his crotch and didn't see what she wanted to see, so she stepped close to him and put her hand there, then started to rub him. I'm really happy that you want to do that to me again. She kissed him and felt him grow under her hand and broke the kiss. I want to do it to you this time. Arnold gave her a look that could be interpreted as skeptical. Kissing me there like that won't work. Heather laughed a knowing laugh. Oh, Arnold. She said. Different places need different kisses. She whispered and stood on her toes and gave his forehead a peck with her lips. She unbuttoned his shirt and leaned in to give him a 3-second kiss on the lips, then she moved down and gave a soft suckling kiss to his nipple, rolled her tongue around it and flicked it once, then suckled it again. Heather looked up at his face and saw that she had his undivided attention. She smiled and gave him light butterfly kisses down his abdomen and stopped when she reached his jeans. With quick movements, she had him unbuttoned and unzipped and slid his jeans down. She stared at the bulge in his underwear and liked what she saw. She hooked the edge of his underwear with her thumbs and slid it down to reveal him completely. It looks like yours is red from rubbing it, too. Heather said and put her hand around it. She looked into his eyes and she leaned forward and gave the tip a big slobbering kiss. She felt it throb and his testicles contracted from the intimate contact. Yes, this needs extra special kisses. She said and kissed it all along the length, then she stuck out her tongue and licked it all the way up to the tip. Arnold stared down at her and wondered where she had learned so many different kinds of kisses. Heather saw the wonderment on his face and decided to blow his mind. Now the best kiss for this area. She whispered, then swirled her tongue around the tip and plunged her mouth over him and started to suck as she bobbed her head. Arnold was a fair size, near the top edge of average at about 7 inches, so Heather felt like she had hit the jackpot. He was smart, handsome, had a great body, and listened to her without question. She knew that he was going to be easy to mold into the perfect boyfriend, mainly because he was so very close to her ideal man already. That made her a little eager in her ministrations, and she felt him start to throb constantly in her mouth. Oh, shit! Heather thought, and her mind raced as she wondered what to do. Then she remembered the pair of underwear that she had discarded earlier. In one smooth motion, as if she had practiced it, she slid him out of her mouth, grabbed the panties and folded them up, then held them over the tip and jerked him off for the few seconds it took for Arnold to finish. We almost made a huge mess that I'd have a hard time trying to explain. Heather laughed and walked over to the bathroom and turned on the faucet on the sink to rinse off her underwear. I hope this doesn't stain too much. She swished them around and tried to rub them, then gave up and tossed them into the garbage can. Heather looked back at him and saw that he wasn't taking care of himself and held in her laugh. You really haven't done that before, she said, and grabbed some tissue paper and walked over to him. She knelt down and gently took hold of him as she wiped at the tip that was still dripping a little. She squeezed it gently and milked out that last little bit, wiped it off, then was surprised as it started to grow again. I'm sorry, your girlfriend doesn't have time to do that again. Do all girlfriends do that? Arnold asked. The good ones do, Heather said, and stood up. Then she tucked him away in his underwear and then zipped up his pants. I'll be right back, she said, and went to the bathroom and washed her hands. Then she used a toothbrush and some mouthwash. There. All evidence gone. Arnold looked down at himself at the bulge still there and then back at her, and she laughed. Okay, not all evidence, Heather said as she buttoned up his shirt. Then she put her arms around his neck and kissed him. Do you want to use the computer for a while? Arnold nodded and they went over to it. He knew what to do this time and turned it and the monitor on and waited. Heather thought about sitting on his lap, then thought better of it. She had indulged herself quite a lot today and there was no way she could get away with doing anything else. She sat on the floor and Arnold spread his legs for her to fit between. I didn't even have to ask, Heather thought happily and looked at the screen as it came on. Okay, the pages are bookmarked, she said, and showed him how to find the bookmarks. Is there something on here to tell me all about computers? Arnold asked. I was thinking of getting one myself, Heather sighed. I was worried he would want to get one and wouldn't need mine anymore. She thought and clicked on the latest model of computers that you could get in pretty much any electronics store. I won't be getting one for a while, because I need to save up for it, Arnold continued. I'd like to keep coming here to use yours. Then I'll show you everything you might want, Heather said, her mood greatly improved. I think I remember you saying you want to model specimens. Arnold nodded. What do I need for that? I'd say a 3D editing program for starters, Heather said, and saw his slight confusion. It's three-dimensional computer modeling software, she said, and searched for a quick video on what it was. Whoa, Arnold said, and moved forward in the chair, which just happened to press his erection into Heather's upper back. She couldn't help her slight shiver, especially since he was still hard. It made her think about how long he would last doing other things. There are free programs out there, and they are difficult to learn because the interface is so awful. Arnold gave her a blank stare and she chuckled. You'll understand what I'm saying soon, Heather said. Remember what I told you before. You have so much more to teach me, Arnold said, and she nodded. After you get a 3D program and learn how to use it, then. Heather went into detail about what the whole process entailed. She even brought up some tutorials for how to do the basics of 3D model editing, from altering an existing model to creating your own from scratch. Can't you just take a picture or something? Arnold asked. Like a lot of people, he wanted his specimens to be instantly accessible. They do have 3D scanners, but they are expensive. Heather said. Although, there are plans to make your own online. Can you show me those? Arnold asked. Heather quickly showed him how people had used mirrors and motion capture software and a game system camera to make a 3D model. The quality was pretty low and Arnold quickly lost interest in that avenue. He would either have to find the specimens already made as a 3D model or make them himself. He knew that was going to take time, though. There are kind of cheats for it, so it's not really all done by hand. Heather said. Can I show you some of them? Arnold nodded and she brought up a basic drawing of a circle. This is a circle, right? Heather asked and he nodded. Okay, well, it's not just a circle. Huh? Arnold looked at her and then at the screen. It can also be a sphere or a dome, or even the end of a cylinder. Heather said with a smile and brought up an image of each. If they are seen from a certain angle, they all look like basic circles. Except for the sphere. That's completely round and always looks like a circle. She said. It's called perspective and all those things you see inside a specimen. They are all just circles, ovals, triangles, squares, and rectangles. It's a trick to use when trying to make sense of something complicated. Arnold watched as Heather brought up one of the pictures she had saved and opened a basic paint program and used the mouse to draw a circle around one of the exposed organs, one around the heart, then an oval around a lung and then a liver. She drew a rectangle around the intestines because she didn't feel like drawing a bunch of ovals. Arnold looked at the screen and then at her, then back at the screen. He had never seen them like that before. When making them in a 3D program, you just use a circle for this part, an oval for this part, and so on. Once you have the basic shapes, you can alter them and make them more detailed and even add the real picture to color them up properly. Heather said. She had read a lot about it in a tutorial she had found online and she looked at Arnold's face. She saw astonishment there and was glad that her hard work had paid off so soon. Can you get one of these 3D programs? Arnold asked. I got one last night. Heather said. It's a little slow when you try to render a scene. She stopped talking when she saw his attention shift. I'll just start it up for you. Arnold let a smile out as the screen changed and the program loaded. When it finished, the screen was filled with a lot of buttons and things that he had no clue about. It's a lot to take in, I know. Heather said. This is why I told you that the interface on them is horrible. She chuckled. I want a big button that I can click to do the work for me and not have to search through a dozen menus to find the one thing I want to do. Heather clicked through 6 menus and chose an option for Create Sphere. A ball with shading appeared on the screen, and she clicked on it and moved it around. Then she moved through the menus again and chose an oval shape and it dropped on top of the sphere. She clicked it and moved it off to the side. You can keep adding them and can make any structure you want. Heather said and clicked on the sphere and then used an option on the side menu to make the sphere editable. A whole bunch of little dots appeared on the surface and she clicked on one and moved it to the right a tiny amount and the sphere changed shape slightly. Arnold watched her stretch out the sphere and then she added a square and joined the circle and the oval together. How are you doing all of that? Hours of hard work and studying. Heather said. Kelly helped me last night with finding the best free program and sorting out the garbage in the online tutorials. She turned and looked at him. I wanted to make sure that I could show you as much as I could. Thank you. Arnold said and leaned forward and kissed her. Heather put her arms around his neck and made out with him. She really liked that she didn't have to ask this time and enjoyed the feeling of his lips on hers. Knock asterisk knock. Hey, you two. Claire said through the door. It's open. Heather said as she broke the kiss. It's getting late. Claire said and saw that she had just interrupted them. I was just showing Arnold some of the 3D editing things Kelly and I found last night. Really? Claire looked at her daughter skeptically and Heather stood and waved at the screen. Arnold just thanked me for doing it and showing him. Claire was a little surprised that she hadn't caught them in a more compromising position. Well, I need to take him home, so save up what you're doing and come downstairs. We were just playing with it, so there's nothing to save. Heather said as she turned around and bent over, then closed the program. Claire looked at Arnold's face to see where he was looking, and his eyes were firmly glued to the screen and at what Heather was doing and not looking at her ass, despite it being right in front of his face and in a pair of short shorts. This surprised her, since most women used their bodies to get a man's attention. If my daughter can walk around like that and he didn't take the obvious hint to look, then how did she gain his interest? Claire asked herself. Heather shut the computer down and stood up straight, then turned to look at Arnold and saw that he was looking up at her face. She didn't see any guilt there, so either he had gotten a really good look and liked what he saw, or he hadn't taken the hint and didn't look at all. She suspected the latter, mainly because he hadn't looked at her when she walked around bottomless. Why would he try to sneak a peek when I had both underwear and shorts on, after seeing me with my legs spread wide for him? Heather asked herself as her face flushed red and she smiled down at him. She gave him a quick hug, then walked over to the bed and tried to pick up his backpack. Ugh! She grunted and could barely move it. What do you have in this thing? Everything. Arnold said and walked over to the bed and picked it up like it was nothing and slung it over his shoulder. I didn't know what homework was assigned, so I have all of my school books in it. Heather had surprise on her face. All of them? She asked. I didn't think you could fit all of our books into a single backpack. Arnold smiled. He had been packing things into spaces for nearly all of his life. A few rectangle-shaped books into an oval backpack was one of the easiest things he's packed. His thoughts paused on what he had just thought. He had immediately assigned shapes to the objects he was thinking about. He stepped close to Heather and put his arms around her. Thank you for showing me that seeing the shapes trick. Arnold said and kissed her. Heather completely forgot that her mother was right there and kissed him back. Her arms snaked around his neck and she let her feelings control her actions and not her brain. Claire stood there for a few moments and watched them making out. She let it go on for nearly a full minute, then she coughed. Ahem. Heather jumped like something had bit her behind and broke the kiss. Mom! Claire had to hold in her laugh. Arnold, I need to get you and your mother home. Arnold nodded and let Heather go. Goodbye, Arnold. Heather said, so he leaned in and kissed her for 3 seconds like always, even though they had just kissed. Goodbye. Arnold said and walked over to the door and past Heather's mother, then he went down the stairs to wait. I'm sorry, Mom. Heather said in a low voice. I didn't mean to, well, he kissed me and... Claire had to laugh this time. I saw you, so it's okay. She said and saw her daughter relax. You just need to be careful what you do with him, all right? Heather nodded. I promise I'll be extra careful. Claire nodded and left her room. She was impressed that he had done that in front of her and wasn't ashamed or even apologetic about it, which confirmed that he was as straightforward as anyone could possibly be. He didn't see anything wrong with making out with a woman's daughter in front of her, so he wouldn't think anyone else would either. Claire let a smile show on her face as she went down the stairs. Have you all got everything? She asked Annie and Arnold. Both of them nodded, so the three of them left the house and climbed into the car. She drove them home and pulled into the driveway. Thank you both for coming over tonight. Claire said. It was nice having some adult company for once while Heather had someone over. She chuckled. Last night it was Heather and Kelly running all over the place. Claire reached over and took her hand. You call me at any time if you need to talk. She said. You know I understand. Annie took a breath and let it out, then she nodded. Claire let her hand go and Annie got out of the passenger side and took the large plastic container of food with her. Arnold opened the back door and got out himself. Arnold, come here for a minute. Claire said and made a wiggle motion with her finger, so he came over to the front door and leaned in. I suggest you wear old clothes that you don't mind getting dirty tomorrow. She said and saw Annie walk to the front door of their house. She knew this would be another good time to test Arnold, so she spoke what she thought were the magic words. Goodbye, Arnold. Arnold took the cue and put a hand behind her head and kissed her for 3 seconds. Goodbye. Claire was a little stunned at how well he had kissed her. That was a spectacular confirmation. Arnold closed the car door and walked towards his house, and Annie waved to her, so she waved back. As long as Heather wasn't around, which was the only restriction I gave him, he will kiss me whenever I say goodbye. Claire thought, then thought of something else and rolled down the car window. Oh. If you have work gloves, you can bring those, too. She called out to him. Okay. Arnold said and shut the front door. The next morning, Arnold was dressed in his old jeans and a tight t-shirt, and his mother had given him a small bag. It had a change of clothes and his clean sneakers, 3 water bottles, a cloth for him to wipe his face off with, a pair of shorts if it got too hot, and a pair of work gloves. You're going to sweat a lot while working, so keep the cloth handy. Annie said and checked him over. I think that's everything. What about lunch? Arnold asked. Claire said she would take care of it. Annie said. It would be the first time in a long while that Arnold would be leaving the house without her, and she hadn't made him a lunch that she knew he would eat. Okay. Arnold said and picked up his backpack and the small bag. Good luck today. Annie said and walked with him to the front door. Take care, all right? Arnold nodded and they heard a car pull up to the curb. He opened the door and stepped out. See you tonight. Annie said and clung to the front door so that she wouldn't grab onto her son and stop him from leaving, even though her mind was screaming at her to do just that. Arnold was oblivious to her dilemma and walked over to the car and got in. After a moment, he got out and walked back over to her and gave her a hug. I love you, Mom. Arnold said and let her out of the hug, then gave her a very quick peck on the lips. He could see her eyes were starting to tear up, so he made a pinching motion with his fingers. His mother reached out and held his hand with both of hers. I love you, too. Annie said. Now get going and listen to what Claire tells you. Arnold nodded and went back to the car, then climbed in and sat next to Heather. I bet she really liked hearing you say that. Claire said and pulled the car out into the street. I'm glad I told him to do that. She started to cry. Arnold said. I think I would, too. Heather said in a whisper. They drove to the high school and Claire pulled up to the edge of the parking lot and waited. It didn't take long for Kelly to come over to the car. Good morning, Mrs. Bradshaw. Kelly said as she bent down to look into the front seat. Morning, Kelly. Claire said. Heather opened her door and picked up her backpack, then looked at the back of her mother's head for a moment. Goodbye, Arnold. She said and kissed him. I'll see you after school. Goodbye. Arnold said. Heather left the car and she and Kelly walked over to the school and went inside. Claire had watched Arnold and he hadn't stared at Heather as she walked away. He just calmly sat there and waited. She smiled, because she assumed that Arnold wasn't going to use or abuse her daughter like the other boys tried to do, and pulled away and drove back to her house. Thanks a lot, Kelly. Heather said to her friend as they approached their lockers. All those things you showed me the other day really came in handy. Arnold liked all the hard work. We did he? Did he ever? Heather said and almost giggled as she opened her locker and changed the things she had in her backpack for the first class. Kelly saw how happy her friend was and couldn't fault her for getting another boyfriend. At least this one wasn't trying to take up all of Heather's time or trying to set me up with one of his pervy friends. She thought. He's still kind of creepy, though. What did he like the best? She asked, genuinely curious, and pushed her other thoughts aside. Heather smiled and leaned in behind her locker door and whispered. When I sucked him off. No way. Kelly was shocked. I thought you were at your house. How did you sneak out? It was in my bedroom. Heather said and picked up her much lighter backpack. Kelly just stared at her with her mouth agape. I know. Heather said with a laugh and closed her locker, then moved down several of them and opened Kelly's locker for her. Come on, get your things for first class. You need to tell me what happened first. Kelly said. Heather grabbed her things for her and changed out Kelly's backpack contents as well. What you should be asking me is what I enjoyed the most. Kelly stared at her and Heather laughed. He went down on me like a deep-sea diver and didn't come up for air until we were interrupted. Oh. My. God. Kelly exclaimed. Just wait until I tell you. Kelly's locker door slammed shut and it startled Heather, Kelly, and 3 other girls that had been nearby listening to Heather talk. Why don't you tell all of us? A guy's voice said, and Heather turned to see a purple-colored face with a bandage around his nose. Brad. Heather spat, then she saw the guy next to him and she grit her teeth. Kevin. That's us. Brad said and tried to smile, then flinched because it hurt. Behind them were 4 other guys who looked just as interested in her story as everyone else. Why aren't you suspended for fighting like Arnold was? Heather asked. The principal couldn't suspend the victims of Arnold's temper tantrum, could he? Brad asked with a sneer, then he winced again and stopped trying to convey emotions with his face. It hurt too much. You started the fight. Heather exclaimed. Actually, Arnold was the first one to attack, in both cases. A man's voice said from across the hall. The biology teacher stood there with his arms crossed and looked at the scene playing out in front of him. I've talked to both the principal and the vice principal and they confirmed that Arnold admitted to it. Heather couldn't argue against a teacher, especially Arnold's favorite teacher, so she stayed quiet. It's quite disappointing to discover that he is as much of a common brute as they are. The biology teacher said and nodded to Brad and his friends. Heather couldn't let that statement stand and still call herself Arnold's girlfriend. Sir, he's no more common than you are. She said, and the teacher gave her an appraising look. He was defending me from a verbal attack. Kelly whispered. A verbal attack from Brad. Heather said. They said they wouldn't report it because Brad asked for the fight and lost. The biology teacher hadn't heard that. When Kevin confronted Arnold, after he made sure that I had left and couldn't stop him, he threatened Arnold for kicking Brad's ass, so Arnold defended himself and kicked Kevin's ass, too. Quite a crowd had gathered in the hallway by this point and a lot of them were shocked by this news. Sir, you know Arnold. He's never reacted to people bullying him before. Heather said, and there were a few murmurs from the crowd in agreement and some of Brad's friends looked uncomfortable. I was the one they were bullying this time, and he protected me. The biology teacher looked at the leader and his face showed his guilt, so he had no choice but to believe her. He was still caught fighting and was suspended for 2 weeks. I'm taking him his homework every day and passing it in for him. Heather said. He won't fall behind his studies at all. The teacher started to let out a sigh when Heather spoke again. Sir, he said he's ready to take your test. Heather said with confidence. The biology teacher couldn't help but stare at the girl. Excuse me. He finished memorizing everything yesterday and told me to tell you he was ready. Heather said. That, he needs to. The biology teacher caught himself before he said what the test was. Where is he now? At home. My boyfriend is at work. Heather said with a smile, and Kelly, the 3 nearby girls, and one of Brad's friends gasped at the news. He wanted to keep busy while he's suspended. He can't take my test until after school anyway, since he's not allowed on school grounds. The biology teacher said. Tell him I will come by his house tonight to administer the test. I'm sure he will be very happy to hear that, sir. Heather said, and then the first bell rang. Everyone get to class. The biology teacher said, and the crowd quickly dispersed. He watched Heather and her friend walk away and couldn't help but be amazed that his unofficial lab apprentice had managed to get the most popular girl in the school as a girlfriend. Kelly waited until they were down the hallway before she spoke in a whisper. Heather. That was so awesome. Heather felt very proud that she had defended Arnold's honor this time. Now tell me what he did. Kelly said with a mischievous smile. Heather chuckled as they took their regular seats and they leaned in close to whisper back and forth, as was their normal practice, and a few other interested ears listened attentively as well until the second bell rang and class started. Arnold stood in front of a shed that was similar to the one at home, except this one had equipment he had never seen before. Claire had changed from her outfit and wore a similar outfit to what Arnold wore. Her old and faded jeans fit her snugly and her t-shirt was old and clung to her like a second skin. Have you used a lawnmower before? Claire asked and he shook his head. Well, it's fairly easy. She said. The gas goes in here, the oil goes in here, this lever is the gas and this is the brake. Claire said and showed him what they were and how they worked. The lawnmower is intended to be used on flat surfaces to cut grass. Be careful with it. Arnold watched her and memorized what to do, then Claire stood up and practically glared at him. If you run over anything, do not stick your hand underneath to see what it was. Do not tip it up to look. Do not flip it over. It is not a toy. It has spinning metal blades underneath that will remove your fingers, toes, and any other body part that gets near it. Claire said in a stern voice. Arnold listened and memorized her words. I know it seems a little daunting with so many things to keep track of, but you'll get the hang of it. Claire said and then smiled. Once I show you how to use it, you probably won't even think of anything except how to keep the lines that the wheels make in the grass straight. Arnold nodded, because that was a good goal to have and it would let him keep track of his progress. We should do a quick walk around the front lawn and see if there's anything there we can move out of the way first. Claire said. No matter how often I check, there's always loose rocks, random sticks, and even pieces of garbage that have to be cleared. Arnold nodded and he followed Claire as she did a survey of the front lawn. It was fairly large and there were trees nearby, so they found quite a few small sticks, a handful of gravel, one large rock that came from somewhere, and a crushed paper coffee cup. See? Claire picked up the coffee cup and shook it. I don't know if garbage gets blown into the yard or if people just toss it here. She walked over to the garbage can beside her front step and tossed it in. Something always ends up here. They put the gravel around a bush at the side of the house and tossed the sticks there, too. Okay, I think that's clear enough. Claire said and they went around to the shed at the back of the house and brought the lawnmower out to the front lawn. Make sure you watch closely. She said and bent over at the waist, gave her ass a little wiggle as she held the brake on the lawnmower, pushed the gas lever ahead one notch and put a foot on the side of the lawnmower to hold it down, then she grabbed the pull start handle and yanked as she stood up. The lawnmower made a rattling noise for a moment and then nothing happened. Claire huffed and pulled again with the same result. She sighed and turned off the gas and let the brake handle go. She had played up bending over to see if Arnold would look at what she thought was her particularly nice ass in a tight pair of jeans. He only had eyes on her hands and what she was doing, however. He really is oblivious to a woman trying to get his attention. Claire thought. If it doesn't start right away, there's a danger of it flooding if you leave the gas on too long. She said and they waited a minute and she tried it again. It didn't work and she sighed again. Damn it. Arnold had seen it several times now and he thought he knew what was wrong. You want to give it a try? Claire asked when she saw that his eyes didn't waver from the lawnmower. Arnold stepped forward and did everything she did, then he grabbed the pull start handle and yanked. Unlike Claire, he was fairly strong from years of digging, so when he jerked on the cord as quickly as he could, the lawnmower turned over immediately and sputtered into life. Claire laughed and gave it a bit more gas to keep it above idling speed. "I'm glad you're here," she said and touched his arm. "I would have been standing around for half an hour trying to start the thing." She smiled and turned the lawnmower around to face the right way. "This thing kicks up grass a lot, even with the bag to catch it, so make sure you always face the bag away from the sidewalk and the street for the first few feet." Arnold watched as Claire walked at a casual pace and pushed the lawnmower all the way across the front lawn, then she moved it over slightly and dragged it all the way back. "You should partially cover the previous cut by about 25%. Claire said. "That way, you catch any grass the wheels may have pressed down the last time." Arnold watched her go all the way back across the huge front lawn, then she turned around and walked back instead of dragging it, because she was now far enough away from the street. He noticed that her cuts did overlap and the lines she made were fairly straight. "If you're wondering how I'm keeping the line straight, I used the sidewalk as a guide for the first 2 passes, then I just followed the wheel tracks," Claire said, as if she read his mind. "You're really smart, Mrs. Bradshaw," Arnold said. Claire was a bit taken aback at his statement for a second, then she smiled, because the scene in her daughter's bedroom the night before made a bit more sense to her. Heather had shown him things on the computer that he had never seen before and that had impressed him. "I'm slowly figuring you out," Claire thought and let the brake engage as she let the lawnmower's handle go. "Why don't you give it a try and show me what you can do?" "How fast can I walk?" Arnold asked as he took her place. "Not much faster than I just was," Claire said. "Too slow and you're wasting both time and gas. Too fast and you're not cutting all of the grass, which wastes time and gas because you need to go back over the spots you missed." Arnold thought about that for a minute. "What if you pushed 2 lawnmowers? You could walk faster and the second lawnmower would cut the grass you missed." Claire stood there for a few moments as she thought about it. "You would use more gas. You'd be using the same amount of gas, actually. I think the limit would be how many mowers you could push," Arnold said and started to walk away. Claire stared at the young man as he easily followed her instructions and walked at the same pace as her all the way across the lawn and then came back. The size of the attached bags would need to be changed to cut down the weight, Arnold said as he turned around. "They would fill at the same rate and—" Claire blinked her eyes as Arnold kept talking and tried to work out how to make cutting a lawn go faster. She stood there as he did the entire front lawn, even though she had planned to do a few other things while he was busy with such a large task. "I'm done of the front, Mrs. Bradshaw," Arnold said less than an hour later. Claire blinked her eyes and looked at him. "Oh. Check the gas and the oil, then we need to let it cool off for a while before we can use it in the backyard." "Okay," Arnold said and brought it to the shed in the backyard and did as she said. The gas was nearly empty, so he topped it up and the oil was fine. Claire was surprised at his efficiency, because it usually took her an hour and a half. She didn't realize that Arnold hadn't stopped to take breaks, or to rest, or to wipe off his face. He had the cloth in his pocket and wiped his face occasionally while he worked, just like his mother told him to. "Let's try the lawn edger next," Claire said. It was nearly the same as the lawnmower in both maintenance and danger, so Arnold quickly understood the nearly identical instructions and they both went to the front yard for the demonstration. "You better start this for me," Claire said and handed it to him. Arnold easily started it for her and handed it back carefully. "I really am glad that you're here, Arnold," Claire said and continued to teach Arnold how to take care of a lawn. He picked up the proper use and the techniques, then took over and worked twice as fast as her. She held in her laugh and wasn't surprised this time at how efficient he was. By the time Claire told Arnold that it was time to take a break for lunch, they were quite drenched in sweat and both the front and back lawns had been mowed. The edges of the lawn were cleaned around the sidewalk, the deck, and the pool. The excess grass that the bag on the lawnmower hadn't caught was raked up and bagged, then the machines were tended to and cleaned as much as possible without touching or exposing the dangerous blades. Claire led Arnold into the house through the back door, which led to the kitchen, and she had him sit down as she took out a plate of prepared sandwiches from the refrigerator. She took the plastic wrap off of the plate and put it on the counter. She leaned against the edge of the counter in her best look-at-me pose and took a sandwich for herself. "Help yourself," Claire said, and Arnold took a sandwich. She expected him to comment that it was made from the same pork roast that he had eaten yesterday, and he just sat there and ate it. She had buttered the bread and added some mayonnaise for taste with a thin layer of lettuce. It was actually quite tasty, even if it was leftovers, and he ate it like he was eating a piece of cardboard. "We did a lot of work this morning," Claire commented to see if he would look at her, and he didn't even flinch. She stopped herself from smiling as she thought about teasing him a little to try and get his attention. She had watched him work all morning, and now she had an 18-year-old man, sweat-covered and with quite a bit of muscle definition, sitting in her kitchen, and it had her worked up a little. Claire finished her sandwich and went back to the refrigerator and grabbed an ice cube from the freezer. She went back to the counter and resumed her pose, then she untied her ponytail and let her dirty blonde hair drop over her shoulders and shook it out. Arnold didn't even look at her as he picked up another sandwich and kept eating. To say that Claire was disappointed that Arnold wasn't enjoying his visual reward for working so hard that morning was an understatement. She sighed, let the bottom of her t-shirt go and the top mostly went back to its original shape and covered her chest, then she tossed the half-melted ice cube into the sink. "I think we can get to weeding the flower beds now," Claire said. Arnold shoved the last of the sandwich he was eating into his mouth as Claire covered the last two sandwiches and put them back into the refrigerator. She gathered her hair back up into a ponytail automatically, as if she had done it thousands of times, then led him back out through the back door of the house and over to the side where the flower beds were. They ran the entire length of the driveway on both sides. "We're going to need some tools to handle a few of the weeds," Claire said, and walked over to the shed. Arnold perked up at her words and followed her. Claire wasn't looking at him and had missed his reaction, so she didn't realize what having access to new tools meant to him. At the back of the shed was a small rack of some of the oddest things Arnold had seen so far. One thing looked like a small three-clawed rake, one was a miniature shovel and he almost laughed at the size, one looked like a tiny pitchfork, and one looked like a really thin shovel, and another that was a shovel but was bent at a 90-degree angle. Claire told him the names of all the different tools and what they were used for. There was a small set of shears that could be used with one hand, a slightly bigger pair, and then a huge pair. Then there were the normal-sized versions of the smaller tools, and they hung on the wall at the side of the shack. Some of those he was familiar with and had never used. Claire handed him several different small tools. "You'll need to put on your work gloves for this." Arnold nodded and did so, then she handed him a set of knee pads and he followed her back out to the flower beds. "Now we get on our hands and knees and start digging out the weeds," Claire said, and knelt down, then used a small spade to churn the dirt and pulled out something that looked like a flower. Arnold knelt beside her and watched what she was doing, then couldn't understand what was happening. "Which ones are the weeds?" Arnold asked. "The ones that don't belong," Claire said, and pulled out another scraggly one by the roots. Arnold knelt there and couldn't make sense of what she said and what she was doing. Claire worked for a few minutes before she noticed that Arnold wasn't helping at all. "Well, don't just stare at it. Start working." Arnold looked from her face to the flowers and back at her face. "I don't know what to do." "Haven't you been watching me?" Claire asked, a little exasperated. "You pick a weed, use the tool to dig it up, and pull it out. It's easy." "But..." Arnold looked at the flower she had just dislodged from the dirt and back at the flower bed. "I don't understand. They are all flowers. How do you decide what ones to take out and what ones to leave?" Claire looked at him like he was speaking nonsense. "Arnold," she said, and straightened up. Are you seriously telling me that you can't tell the difference between a weed? She held up a yellow flower in her hand. And a flower? She pointed to another yellow flower that was almost the same, except it didn't have the same number of petals on it. Arnold looked at the two flowers and knew that if it was the petals that made the difference, then half of the flowers were weeds and needed to be removed. That would have been easy for him. The problem was that they weren't all yellow flowers and were all different colors. Did he compare the colors and take the ones that the petals didn't match, or only compare them to the petals that matched the yellow flower? His mind raced as he tried very hard to figure it out. I can 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 figure it out. Claire sat back on her heels and watched Arnold's face contort slightly and his eyes flicked over the flowers in the flower bed faster and faster. She could see the signs of panic start to build in him as his eyes started to move even faster and his breathing sped up. She dropped the weed that her brain could very easily pick out of the beautiful flowers, pulled off her gloves, and cupped the sides of his face. Arnold! Stop! Claire yelled and turned his face towards hers. Arnold's shifting eyes started to slow down and his breathing evened out. After a few moments, his eyes focused entirely on the face in front of him. Claire had to stop herself from gasping as the handsome and stoic young man gave her the sweetest and sincerest puppy dog eyes she had ever seen. Her motherly instincts went into overdrive because he looked so lost and forlorn. I want you to ignore the flowers, Claire said. You don't even have to look at them anymore, okay? Arnold nodded and the lost look in his eyes faded away and his face became what she thought was its normal stoic facade. Claire fought her urge to hug him, mainly because they were both covered in sweat and a little bit of dirt. Her resolve only lasted a few seconds and then she put her arms around him and hugged him tightly. She held him against her chest for nearly 30 seconds before she eased her grip and let him go. Let's go do something a little simpler, Claire said as she stood up and held a hand out to him. Arnold took the hand and stood up, then he was led back over to the shed. Normally, we would start with the small handheld clippers to trim the outer branches on the smaller bushes, but we're going to skip that and go right to trimming the hedges. Arnold nodded and listened to her as she described using the large two-handed shears, then she pointed to an odd-shaped gas-powered tool that looked like a chainsaw, except it had huge teeth instead of a chain. We won't be using that today, Claire said. I've always been wary of something like that, since all of the blade is completely exposed and it cuts bushes and branches as if they were nothing. Arnold nodded again and Claire took the large shears and led him over to the side of her yard where a large row of slightly unkept hedges separated her property from the neighbors. She had held his hand the whole time and only now let it go, so she could demonstrate how to use the shears. I know it looks like a lot to handle, but it's very simple. You only need to square it up, Claire said and used the large shears to trim off the top of the hedge and made it flat. She had cut and cleared away about 2 feet of it and then did the side. See? Only 2 flat edges. One on top and one on the side. Arnold easily saw the squared-off shape and nodded, so Claire handed him the shears and waved at the hedge. Arnold copied her movements and did the next 2-foot section on top and on the side and cleared the cut parts away and dropped them by the hedge. You can go all along the top towards the street and make it flat first, clean it off, then come back and do the sides, Claire said. I'll go along and follow you with the wheelbarrow and we can dump the trimmings at the back of the property. Arnold handed her the shears and ran over to the shed and lifted down the wheelbarrow from the hook it hung from and carried it out to her. Claire held in her laugh at the sight. Put it down and I'll show you how it's supposed to work. Arnold put it down and she showed him. He took over and walked several turns around her and then brought it over to the hedge and tossed in all of the things they had trimmed. He left and came back with the fan rake and gathered the small leaves as well and put them into the wheelbarrow. He went back to her and handed her the rake and took the shears, then went to the hedge and trimmed and cleared about 10 feet and tossed all of the branches into the wheelbarrow. He stopped and moved the wheelbarrow almost 20 feet away from where it just was, then handed her the shears and took the fan rake to clean up the leaves and added them to the wheelbarrow. Claire walked over to the wheelbarrow and exchanged tools with him, then stood there as Arnold cleared a 20-foot section and every single branch and twig was tossed into the wheelbarrow. When he switched tools and raked up the leaves, the wheelbarrow was full and needed to be dumped. "Be careful of the balance, or you'll be cleaning up everything you just cleaned up again," Claire said. Arnold nodded and picked up the handles of the wheelbarrow, moved forward and back to feel out the weight, then nodded again. "All right. Follow me," Claire said and walked at a normal pace, like she had shown him while mowing the lawn, and led Arnold all the way to the back of the property. Arnold dumped the wheelbarrow where she pointed and Claire kept speaking as they walked back to where they had just worked on the hedges. "Once all the hedges are done, I'll rent a wood chipper and we can feed all of this into it and make some nice mulch to spread around to the base of the trees, the bushes by the house, and put some under the hedges to keep them healthy." Arnold parked the wheelbarrow at the next section and cleared the top of the hedge completely, then went all the way back where they had started and did all along the side of the hedge and squared it off. It took several trips with the wheelbarrow to clean up the mess and then Arnold worked in the other direction and went all the way to the back of the property. "Arnold, I need to go grab a quick shower and then I need to pick Heather up at school," Claire said as she looked at her watch. "Okay," Arnold said and kept working. "I don't think I should leave him here by himself," Claire thought. "Maybe you should stop working and come inside with me." "Okay," Arnold said and finished a cut, cleaned up the leaves, then went to the large pile of hedge trimmings and added to the pile. He brought the tools and the wheelbarrow back to the shed, used the cloth he had and wiped off everything he had used, including the wheelbarrow, then hung everything up. "I didn't mean, never mind," Claire said. She had been a bit too stunned at how quickly he had done it to stop him before he had finished putting everything away. "Come on." Claire walked over to the back door and went into the house, kicked off her old shoes that she always wore when working around the house, then walked through the kitchen and down the hallway. She went up the stairs and entered her bedroom, then let out a long sigh as she pulled off her t-shirt and tossed it into the dirty clothes hamper inside the door. Annie was right. You need to tell him and show him exactly what to do or he might get confused about it, Claire thought as she peeled off her jeans and tossed them into the hamper, then slipped off her panties and tossed them in, too. She walked over to the bathroom and remembered Arnold almost freaking out about weeding the flowers. "I almost broke my promise to Annie." Claire sighed again and unhooked her bra and hung it up on the hanger behind the bathroom door to let it air out, then she turned on the shower and waited for the hot water to kick in. She turned to the mirror to check the condition of her hair to decide if it needed to be washed or just brushed, then she caught sight of someone in the bathroom doorway. "Ah!" Claire yelled and whirled around as she covered herself with her hands, then she saw who it was. "Arnold! What are you doing? You told me to come inside with you," Arnold said. I didn't." Claire started to deny it, then she closed her eyes as she once again remembered what Annie had told her about him. Or warned me about. She thought and opened her eyes to look at him. "He listened to me and did just as I said and followed me, then I undressed in front of him because I assumed he would have stayed downstairs on his own." "Oh, out," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Wait downstairs for me." "Okay," Arnold said and turned around and left. "At least he didn't undress like I did and try to join me in the shower," Claire thought in relief as she walked over to the bathroom door and shut it. Of course, once she thought that, her mind created the entire scenario and she saw herself inviting him in with her to help wash her back. She let out a nervous laugh and looked at herself in the mirror. She was a bit older and a bit plumper than she was as a teenager, but that was understandable, since she had Heather and her body had changed quite a lot during pregnancy. Claire used her fingers to flick the flesh to gauge how much flab had worked into the cheeks and they only shook as much as they had the last time she checked. She smiled and nodded, because her lunges and squats had kept up their promise of keeping her ass firm. She climbed into the shower and started to wash herself and had forgotten to cover her hair. She sighed, because she had intended to only take a quick shower and now she would have to shampoo her hair. As she washed the rest of her body, her fingers discovered that the spot between her legs was a bit more sensitive for some reason. She wouldn't admit to herself that it was because of the little forbidden shower fantasy she had imagined, even though she used that imagery to create a tall faceless man that had a recognizable blonde buzzcut, and he made passionate and frantic love to her in the shower. Arnold stood at the bottom of the stairs and waited for 20 minutes for Heather's mother to come down. He heard hurried footsteps as they came over to the top of the stairs and he looked up to see Claire as she pulled on a thin turtleneck sweater that matched the skirt she wore. She ran down the stairs and stopped by the front door and put on her nice shoes. "Arnold, we need to have a talk about what happened," Claire said. "I'm running late, so it has to wait." She grabbed her keys from the rack by the door and grabbed the door handle, then turned to give him a good firm stare. "Do not talk about seeing me naked with anyone except me and only when we are alone." "Okay," Arnold said. "I'll be back with Heather soon, so go upstairs into the spare room and use the shower there. Dry off, put on your clean change of clothes and put your dirty clothes into the bag, then come downstairs and wait for us in the kitchen." "Okay," Arnold said and watched as Claire left, then he did as she said. He had a shower, changed into clean clothes, then waited for them in the kitchen. Where could she be? Heather asked 10 minutes after school had ended. She was a little worried because her mother had always arrived early enough to be there when she came out of school. "Maybe something happened and she's running late," Kelly said. Heather caught her breath and immediately thought something bad had happened to Arnold. "Oh, no. I didn't mean anything bad," Kelly said and gave Heather a quick hug to reassure her friend. Just then, the familiar car Heather's mother drove came into the parking lot and both girls visibly relaxed. It came to a stop right in front of them and the passenger window rolled down. "I took a shower before coming here and forgot to cover my hair first," Claire said, and both girls nodded understanding and climbed into the back seat. They had both made that mistake a few times and it always added another 10 minutes or more to their showers. Claire put up the window and drove out of the parking lot. "I was worried something might have happened to make you late," Heather said. Claire was very glad that her daughter never looked into the rear-view mirror to see her face, because it flushed red as she blushed. "Arnold saw me completely naked," she thought, then her mind went right to wondering if he had seen Heather naked, too. She knew Heather had changed while upstairs with him yesterday, but, did she do it in front of him or did she go into the bathroom? They drove all the way back to Heather's place and pulled into the driveway. Heather saw the manicured lawn and the trimmed hedge on one side that hadn't been flat in a long time. The three of them exited the car and Claire took her daughter's hand as Kelly came around the car to stand by them. "Don't mention the flower beds," Claire warned them. "I told Arnold not to think about them and that he didn't have to look at them." Heather squinted her eyes slightly. "So, something did happen." "I believe I overwhelmed him with too many options," Claire said, her voice sad. "If I had to describe it, I think he started to have a panic attack." "MOM," Heather yelled. She had had her own experiences with things like that, as had several of her classmates, Kelly included. "Shoo!" Claire hushed her. "I caught it before it happened and he's fine. He should be in the kitchen right now waiting for us." "Mom, God." Heather shook her head. "He's only been here a day and you." She let out a sigh. "Are you sure he's okay? It happened right after lunch and he worked for several hours after that, so he's okay," Claire said. "I wanted to warn you about the flower beds, just in case if you mentioned them and it reminded him." "All right," Heather said. "I won't mention it. I'll keep my mouth shut upon pain of death," Kelly promised dramatically. Heather laughed and Claire smiled. I don't think things are quite drastic enough to require a death sentence, Kelly. Claire said. Just be careful about what you say. Kelly nodded and she followed her friend's mother and her friend into the house. We're back. Claire said loudly, then they all took off their shoes and walked through the house to the kitchen. Arnold sat on the same stool he had sat on during lunch. Hi, Arnold. Heather said a little more boisterously than she normally would have and walked over to him to give him a 3-second kiss and a hug. She held the hug for a bit and let him go. I saw the lawn and the hedge. It looks great, she said and smiled. I haven't been able to see over the hedge since last year. It's not done, Arnold said. We had to stop when your mom had to go and get you. That's good, because now we can do homework, Heather said. They gave us a lot today. I'll get my backpack, Arnold said and went to the front door and grabbed it, then went back to the kitchen. Go ahead and use the table down here, Claire said and pointed to the dining room. With the 3 of you here, you're going to need the extra room. Heather knew her mother wanted to keep an eye on Arnold after what happened, so she nodded her understanding and led Arnold and Kelly to the dining room. They unpacked their homework to start working on it, and even though the table was a large one, once the 3 of them had their things out, it covered nearly half of the table. I think this is ridiculous, Kelly said as she sat down and looked at the spread of books in front of her. Every teacher we had today gave us something to do. Heather laughed as she sat down. I think they wanted to make up for not giving us homework yesterday, she said, not realizing that she just exposed her deceit from the day before. Sure, Mom, Heather said, then she leaned in close to Arnold. I talked to the biology teacher and he said that he would be by your place tonight to give you the test. Arnold only nodded and started to read the assigned math questions. That didn't even get a reaction out of him, and it's his favorite subject, Heather thought in concern. He should have at least smiled or something. Heather waited a moment and looked to see if her mom was busy, then she leaned close to Arnold and kissed his cheek. When he turned his head to ask her what the kiss was for, she gave him a proper one on the lips. It lasted for several moments, about twice as long as their normal hello and goodbye kisses. Everything is going to be okay, Heather whispered to him, then she sat up straight and started to read the same math questions. Kelly had watched them and couldn't help but feel a little envious, until she realized that if she was the one who was going through what Arnold was going through, Heather would try to comfort her, too. She smiled as she ran a hand through her wavy brown hair. She tucked it behind her ear and out of the way as she leaned over her book and read the same math questions. Claire worked in the kitchen and also kept an eye on Arnold. She hadn't missed the lingering kiss or Heather's whispers. She had considered hiding the incident with Arnold's panic attack, so it wouldn't embarrass him, but she was glad that she hadn't and had warned Heather and Kelly about it. Now they would be watching Arnold as well to make sure that he was okay. Arnold, Heather, and Kelly worked constantly for just over 2 hours until they were done. Once again, it was Arnold that helped them with some of the particularly difficult homework questions. Neither Heather nor Kelly were surprised by this, since Arnold always did well in school. You look so relieved, Claire said as she came into the dining room. Heather let out a short laugh. I bet everyone feels that way after all this, she said and waved at the mass of notes and papers they had written. My fingers are sore and feel like they are going to fall off. Arnold didn't miss a beat as he reached out and took her hand and lightly caressed her fingers, then he gave them a kiss. Claire and Kelly were surprised at the gesture, then they were really surprised when he did her other hand. Thanks, Arnold, Heather said, her face red. That does feel better. Arnold's mouth twitched into a small smile and then it went back to normal. Claire recovered from her surprise quickly. I'm about to serve supper, so pack everything up and clear the table. Arnold, Heather, and Kelly put their school books away and Claire served them supper, then sat down herself. They ate the meal and didn't really talk, except for an occasional comment from Kelly about the food and how good it was. Arnold finished first, since he ate mechanically and had just spooned the food into his mouth at a constant rate and didn't really taste it. He finished his glass of soda pop as well and picked both the glass and his plate up and took them to the sink. He rinsed both items and washed his hands, then went back to the dining room and sat down. Claire, Heather, and Kelly stared at him for a few seconds before they resumed eating. They all thought it was odd behavior, considering Claire had a dishwasher and never did them by hand. Then they all came to the same conclusion that he must do it at home. They finished their food and sat back, and Claire thought this was a good time to try another test. "Arnold, do our plates, too," Claire said. Arnold stood and gathered all 3 plates and took them to the sink and rinsed them off. "Mom, you," Heather started to say, and Claire shook her head. Arnold washed his hands and came back to the table and sat down. "Thank you, Arnold," Claire said. "It's getting late, so get your things and I'll take you home before your mother gets too worried about you." Arnold nodded and grabbed his backpack, then left the dining room to go and get the bag with his dirty clothes in it. "I think I better go, too," Kelly said and stood as she grabbed her own backpack. "Could you give me a ride, Mrs. Bradshaw?" "Of course. It's practically on the way to drop off Arnold. I was hoping you would stay so we could hang out," Heather said, a little pointedly. Kelly let out a little sigh. "My dad warned me that I should be home at a reasonable time. Claire stood up as she laughed. "I understand that he's worried about you roaming around at night, so why don't you tell your mom that you're staying over for the weekend and they won't have to worry about you roaming at all?" "Really?" Heather and Kelly asked at the same time. "Tomorrow's Friday, so make sure you pack enough clothes for 3 days, including your outfit for school on Monday," Claire cautioned her. "I'll bring my packed suitcase to school in the morning," Kelly said with excitement. "I'll take it from you when I drop Heather off," Claire said. "That way, you're not dragging it around the school all day." "Thanks, Mrs. Bradshaw," Kelly said. Heather stood and followed her mother and her friend out to the front door, and Arnold came down the stairs with his bag. "I'll see you in the morning," she said to him and gave him a quick kiss and a hug. Claire, Kelly and Arnold left the house and climbed into the car, then Claire drove part way towards Arnold's place, then took a detour. After a few minutes, Claire pulled into a driveway with a nice ranch-style house. It was only 1 story and spread across the whole property. "Thanks again for the drive, Mrs. Bradshaw," Kelly said and looked at Arnold. Even though she thought he was a bit creepy because of how he acted most of the time, he was her best friend's boyfriend and he had just lost his father. So, she made an attempt to be his friend and reached over to take his hand. "Heather's right, you know. Everything is going to be okay." Arnold knew he needed to respond in some way, so he nodded. Kelly smiled and let his hand go. "Goodbye, Arnold." Arnold took the cue and leaned in as he put a hand behind her head and expertly kissed her. 1, 2, 3. He counted in his head and broke the kiss. "Goodbye." Kelly sat there with her mouth slightly open. "Hey Arnold. You can't kiss me like that." "Why?" Arnold asked and noticed Claire in the rear-view mirror as she smiled at him. Because," Kelly responded, as if he should know why already. "Aren't you Heather's boyfriend?" Arnold nodded. "It's a goodbye kiss." Kelly stared at him and blinked her eyes for a moment. "It really is just a goodbye kiss," Claire said as she turned around and looked into the back seat. But, Kelly stammered. "You want proof?" Claire asked and didn't want for an answer. "Arnold, kiss her like Heather kisses you when she thinks I'm not looking." "Wait, Kelly started to say, then Arnold kissed her like Claire told him to. Kelly was stiff at first and looked like she was going to try and fight against it, then she visibly relaxed and kissed him back. Pretty enthusiastically, too. Claire let it go on for about 30 seconds, just so Kelly would understand the difference. Okay, Arnold. That's enough. Arnold broke the kiss with his tongue still halfway in Kelly's mouth, and she closed her lips on it and sucked as he pulled away. Kelly's face was flushed red and her eyes had a slightly distant look to them. She had never been kissed like that before. In fact, she never even imagined being kissed like that. You see? That's how he kisses. The other kiss is just Arnold saying goodbye. Kelly took a shaky breath and let it out as she recovered from the effect the kiss had on her, then she looked at Heather's mother. Oh, okay. I get it. She said and sat there for nearly 10 seconds as she considered what to do next, then she decided and looked at Arnold. Goodbye, Arnold. Arnold put his hand behind her head and kissed her for 3 seconds. Goodbye. Kelly didn't say anything else and opened the car door, grabbed her backpack, and quickly walked towards her house. She has the same restriction as I do, Claire said as she looked at Arnold. Don't kiss her in front of Heather, unless Heather tells you to. Okay. Arnold said, and Claire turned back to face the front and drove Arnold home. When they arrived, another car was in the driveway, so Claire dropped him off at the curb. I'll see you in the morning, Arnold. Claire said, then she decided to have a little thrill for herself after seeing Kelly enjoy it so much, and spoke the keyword herself. Goodbye. Arnold leaned forward and put a hand behind her head and gave her a 3-second kiss. Goodbye. He said, grabbed his bag and backpack, and left the car. Claire blew the car horn as she pulled away, and that got the attention of Arnold's mother and her unexpected guest inside the house. Finally. Annie said as she opened the front door to greet her son. We had a lot of homework and Heather's mother served us supper afterwards. Arnold said. I'm glad she's taking care of you. Annie said and shut the door, then led Arnold into the dining room. He's been here for half an hour waiting for you. Heather said you were coming over later tonight. Arnold said and looked at the clock. It's not later yet, is it? The biology teacher shook his head. I was too excited over hearing you were ready and rushed over here. He said and waved at the large cloth-covered thing on the table. Go ahead. When you look at it, you'll know what to do. Sir, do I need to prepare anything? Arnold asked and dropped his bag and took off his backpack. Everything you need for the test is right there. The biology teacher said. Don't rush. Annie said, and the teacher looked at her with a frown. I didn't reveal what it was. She said to him and looked back at Arnold. Take your time and do your best. Arnold nodded and walked over to the end of the table and lifted the cloth. His eyes widened as he beheld a creature he had never seen before. It looked like a cross-mix of a hamster, a rat, and a beaver. I know you've never seen something like this before, so this is the perfect test for you. The biology teacher said. Use the guidebook to determine its species, genus, and family. I won't let you go into it without a hint, so use its distinct tail to narrow the choices down. Arnold nodded without looking up from the specimen. The test is to create your own specimen, right down to removing and labeling everything. The biology teacher said. The tools have already been prepped, as is your work area, so you don't need to worry about that. He walked over to Arnold and put a hand on his shoulder. Your mother is right. There's no time limit. Be careful, be thorough, and get it done. Yes, sir. Arnold said. The biology teacher stepped back out of the way. Arnold expertly slipped on a pair of rubber gloves as a smile spread across his face, then he got to work. Despite the animal's nearly 2-kilogram weight and foot-long body, not counting the nearly foot-long tail, it only took Arnold an hour to completely dissect, identify, label, and replace everything inside the specimen. Using the distinct traits of the animal, he had determined the kingdom as Animalia, the phylum as Chordata, the class as Mammalia, the order as Rodentia, the species as Zibethicus, the genus as Ondatra, the family as Chrysetidae, and the subfamily as Arvicellini. Arnold turned to the biology teacher. "It's a muskrat," he said, wrote it onto a small piece of paper, stuck it into the pre-made laminated holder, then placed it on the belly of the specimen. The biology teacher was blown away that Arnold had gone well above and far beyond his expectations of just species, genus, and family and had discovered the common name by using the guidebook. The intricate work he did on the dissection and adding all of the labels and putting it back together, was near or equal to his own level of skills. I knew he had picked up some of my techniques during the last couple of months, but it's amazing. The biology teacher thought as Arnold cleaned the tools he used in the small basin and then went to the kitchen and washed his hands. Annie, on the other hand, had to close her eyes for most of it, and even with a face mask on, she gagged occasionally at the smell of the preserved specimen as it was cut up. Arnold came back into the dining room and sat down to wait. He knew his teacher was going to need some time to inspect his work, just like everyone else did, and then the biology teacher spent almost 20 minutes going over everything he did. "Arnold," the biology teacher said when he was finished inspecting everything, "I've never seen anyone as young as you perform like that," he said. "If I hadn't seen you perform this task with my own eyes, I might have accused you of cheating in hiring a professional." He reached out and put a hand on Arnold's shoulder. "Your skills are as proficient as mine and I am very proud of you." Arnold wasn't sure how to respond or even if he was supposed to. "Yes, I'm almost as speechless as you are." The biology teacher laughed. "Needless to say, you passed my test. Quite easily and fairly quickly, too." "What does it mean?" Annie asked. She had been about to ask what the test was for when Arnold came home and interrupted her. "Didn't I say?" the biology teacher asked, and both Annie and Arnold shook their heads. "Well, first off is a small bursary of $1,000 from the school board that they award for outstanding scholastic achievements." Annie choked and coughed, then sputtered out one word. "WH what?" "I know that's not much, but it's the recognition that's important," the biology teacher said. "You see, it automatically submits Arnold for various college scholarships and their related bursaries in regards to this field of study, assuming he takes the recommended classes to further his education." Annie stared at the man like he was shoveling the biggest pile of crap she had ever seen. "Nothing is concrete, of course. We won't find out until the term ends next month if he's eligible." "Why so long?" Annie asked. "Another $1,000 would definitely be a big help right now. That's when the review board meets again," the biology teacher said. "That doesn't affect the school bursary, though. You should get that in about 2 weeks." "Thank you," Annie said. "I should be thanking you," the biology teacher said. "This is the first time I've ever been able to administer the college-level test." He nodded to Arnold. "You've raised a great young man here." Annie closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at Arnold. He had his flaws, his problems, and his quirks, but she loved him and had known that he was something special his whole life. Now that she had proof, she was filled with both pride and satisfaction, because all of her hard work had been worth it. "Well, I'll just pack this up and get out of your way," the biology teacher said, and put away the test, the tools and equipment, and then used the special disinfectant he used at the lab to clean off the table. He had covered the table with the appropriate safety materials, but it didn't hurt to make sure things were completely clean anyway. Annie and Arnold watched the biology teacher work, then he thanked them again for letting him come here with it, then left. "Well." Annie stood there and stared at the front door. "That just happened," she said, then she turned to her son and gave him a hug. "I'm very proud of you, Arnold." Arnold hugged her back, and when she leaned away to look into his eyes, he spoke. "I love you, Mom," he said, and gave her a quick kiss on the lips. Annie took a shallow breath. "If you keep telling me that, I might start crying." Arnold let her go as a small smile appeared on his face, then he raised both hands and made pinching motions with his fingers. Annie laughed and put her hands on his. I said might. Arnold nodded and his mother led him to the living room so they could sit down. How was work today? Did you do a good job? Annie asked. Arnold told her about learning how to take care of a lawn properly, then about how he trimmed the hedges by hand. He described everything he did, except for the flower bed, because Claire had told him to ignore the flowers and he did. You might actually finish the hedges on both sides of her property tomorrow. Annie said, once she had a rough estimation of how quickly Arnold could work. I don't think there's too much else to do for yard work after that. Arnold didn't know if that was true or not, so he didn't say anything. He knew Claire was pretty smart, so if there was something else to do, she would tell him when he was ready. You already had a shower and did your homework, so I guess there's not much else for you to do tonight. Annie said. Why don't you go get changed and go to bed and I'll wash your work clothes for tomorrow. Okay. Arnold said and left the living room and went upstairs. Kelly's suitcase had been packed in under 15 minutes and it waited by her bedroom door for the morning. She now laid in bed and stared at the ceiling, wide awake, because she was having an existential crisis about what to do about Arnold. On one hand, he was her best friend's boyfriend and apparently was the best boyfriend she had ever had. On the other hand, he had no problem with kissing other girls goodbye. Normally that wouldn't have bothered her very much. It was just that his goodbye kiss seemed like it was a little scandalous and quite shameless. Heather's mother had said that it was just a goodbye kiss, so she knew that Arnold kissed like that. Kelly thought. When she told Arnold to kiss me like he kisses Heather. Her thoughts trailed off as she remembered what that felt like. That was the part Kelly was having trouble with. She knew after she had told Arnold goodbye the second time and he had kissed her again, that if she went to him and asked him to kiss her like he kissed Heather, he would do it without question. She was pretty sure that he was not a good boyfriend because of that. Kelly remembered her heart pounding in her ears as Arnold kissed her and they made out for what seemed like forever. She really enjoyed the feeling of his soft but firm lips on hers, how they moved expertly, and then there was his gently probing tongue. His tongue. Kelly thought. She remembered Heather's pretty explicit description of what Arnold did to her the other night. Oh, God. His tongue. Kelly shivered as she imagined that tongue probing between her legs. She rolled onto her side and reached between her legs and pretended her finger was Arnold's tongue as she flicked and probed herself with it. I'm sorry, Heather. I'm such a bad friend. Kelly exclaimed loudly in her mind as she came. Heather laid in bed and wondered how Arnold was. She was tempted to call, but her mother had said that there was a strange green car in the driveway. She knew the biology teacher was going to be at Arnold's house to give him some kind of test, so that must have been him. The problem she had was that she didn't know how long the test was, or even what it was, and she didn't want to call and potentially interrupt. Heather sighed and hugged her pillow as if it was Arnold. I love you. She whispered to pillow Arnold and gave him a light kiss, then snuggled her face down into his pillowy softness and fell asleep. Claire laid in bed and couldn't get to sleep, because her mind kept going back to seeing Kelly's near euphoric face when Arnold had stopped kissing her. That poor girl must have had such a thrill. Claire thought with a smile. Not only did she get her first grown-up kiss, it was from her best friend's boyfriend, too. Claire held in her chuckle at the thought, then she imagined what she would have done if she had been a teenager in Kelly's position and had gotten kissed like that. Annie laid down in bed and thought back over the events of the evening. Meeting the slightly good-looking biology teacher was definitely a highlight, except for the pervasive smell of embalming fluid, or formaldehyde. It was at times like these that she missed her husband the most. It's not that he smelled any better with stale beer and the resultant gaseous expulsions that came with it, it was because she missed having someone else in the bed. Annie had shared a bed with Gerald for nearly 25 years and she loved him, despite all of his faults and the things he had done. Even after throwing away their life savings, she still loved him. Her eyes started to water and she took several shaky breaths, then let out a soft sob before she could stop it. A moment later, her bedroom door opened and Arnold stood there. "Hey Arnold." Annie whispered and wiped at her tears so he wouldn't pinch her. Arnold walked over to the bed and instead of pinching her for crying like she thought he would, he climbed onto the bed beside her and hugged her. "I love you, Mom," Arnold said and gave her a quick kiss on the lips. Annie burst out crying and tried to turn away from him. Don't pinch me." Arnold held her still and looked into her eyes. "I only said I would pinch you if you cried over Dad." "Arnold," Annie said and clung to him. He had never given her a verbal condition like that before. "How can you tell? You look happy now," Arnold said, to her surprise. "I'm happy," Annie asked herself, then she realized she actually was happy. Even though she was crying in sorrow only moments before, when Arnold told her that he loved her, it made her happy. "I am happy." Annie smiled and wiped at her face. "It's because I love you, too." They were both quiet until Arnold remembered what Heather had whispered that morning. "Heather said she might cry if I said that to her," Arnold said, and Annie took in a sharp breath. Are you going to say it?" Annie asked and then immediately covered his mouth so he wouldn't speak. "Don't answer that. Even though I am your mother and I want to know, that should be between you and Heather." Arnold didn't say anything until she moved her hand. "You don't want me to say it?" Annie sighed. "I think you're a little too young to." She stopped herself before she gave him any ideas. "Arnold, if you think she's ready to hear it from you, then you should tell her." "Even though you don't want me to?" Arnold said. "Yes, even though," Annie said and caressed the side of his face. "I won't say anything cheesy, like I want to go with you wherever you go, so I can keep you safe and protect you," she said with a sad smile. "I really want to do that and I know I physically can't. Just seeing you working on that specimen today nearly made me throw up, which proved my point." "What if?" "I don't want to throw up any more than you would want me to throw up on one of your specimens." Arnold had to agree that would be bad. "I'll be happy just watching you doing your best," Annie said and leaned forward to give him a kiss on the forehead, then remembered what he had said about not caring enough about him if she only kissed his forehead. She gave his forehead a quick peck, then moved down and gave him a gentle kiss on the lips. "You should get to sleep." "Okay," Arnold said and closed his eyes. He took in a deep breath and let it out as he relaxed. Annie thought about telling him to go to his own bed to sleep, then she changed her mind and rolled over to face away from him. "Am I that desperate to have someone else in the bed that I'll let my own son share it with me?" The bed moved a little and she felt Arnold's breath on the back of her neck as he moved closer. "Arnold, you," Annie started to say, then stopped her automatic rejection. "I guess I am," she thought with a depreciating smile. "Give me a hug," she said, and his arms went around her waist and held onto her and his forehead pressed into the back of her neck. She closed her eyes at the comforting embrace and took a deep breath and let it out as she hugged his arms. "Good night." "Good night," Arnold said. He had lots of memories of his mom cuddling him to sleep when he was a kid. He drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face because it was finally his turn to cuddle her to sleep. The biology teacher once again completely took apart the specimen that Arnold had prepared and took pictures of everything, then put it back together. He even labeled the major and minor arteries, along with the nerve bundles in the spine. He thought in amazement and moved the reassembled specimen aside. "This can't wait until morning." The biology teacher walked over to his desk and picked up the telephone. He called one of his colleagues at the local college and disregarded the late hour. He knew his friend would want to hear about this as soon as possible. After his friend ranted and raved at him for nearly 10 minutes for calling so late, he reluctantly agreed to take a look at the photos that were being sent to him by email. Once he saw the photos, the friend ranted and raved at the biology teacher because he hadn't called and told him about Arnold months ago. Unaware of all of the changes going on with the people in his life, Arnold woke up in the arms of his mother. He wasn't sure how he had gone from cuddling her from behind to having his head snuggled to her chest. She had an arm around him and stroked his hair. "Mom." Arnold started to sit up and saw that she was propped up on her pillow and sat against the headboard. "Good morning," Annie said and let him go. "Good morning," Arnold said and kissed her. He only did a quick kiss like when he told her he loved her, because he remembered Claire's advice about not kissing his mom like he kissed Heather. Annie had been worried that he might have taken staying in her room as permission to kiss her like he had kissed her the other morning when saying goodbye, so she felt relief that all he did was a quick peck. "What do you want for breakfast?" Annie asked and stood up. Her boy shorts and t-shirt were a little disheveled from moving around in the bed and she straightened them out. Arnold shrugged and she chuckled. "Eggs and toast it is," Annie said and waved for him to follow. Arnold got up and followed her and didn't bother straightening his clothing, since he would be taking them off soon. His mother gave him breakfast and told him to go upstairs and get changed, then she prepped his bag for work. She saw that his water bottles hadn't been touched and assumed that Claire had kept him hydrated, then she went up the stairs to his room to add a change of clothes for him. She left the shorts and added jeans, a shirt, and clean underwear and socks that matched. "Here you go," Annie said and handed him the refreshed bag and Arnold took it and his backpack. A horn blew and they both went downstairs and Annie opened the front door. She wasn't as anxious today to see her son leaving the house without her, mainly because she had convinced herself that he was going to learn and had put the situation into the "going to school by himself is fine" category. "Goodbye, Arnold," Annie said before she could stop herself. She opened her mouth to try and correct her mistake, then Arnold put a hand behind her head and she clamped her mouth shut instead. Arnold leaned in and only gave her a quick kiss on the lips, just like he had when they woke up. "Goodbye," he said and walked to the car. "I guess I don't have to talk with him about appropriate kisses," Annie thought in surprise, mainly because she had completely forgotten that she was supposed to. With everything that had been going on lately, it had slipped from her mind. She bent over slightly and looked into the car and Claire waved to her. Claire must have talked to him about it, especially if he kissed Heather like that in front of her. She thought as she waved back. "I have to remember to thank her." The car drove away and Claire took Heather to school. They sat in the parking lot and waited for Kelly to show up, then Claire put Kelly's suitcase into the trunk. Heather kissed Arnold goodbye and got out. "I can't wait for tonight," Kelly said excitedly. "It's always fun when I get to stay over and now I'll be there all weekend." Heather laughed softly and gave her friend a one-arm hug, then the both of them went into the school. Claire waited until they were out of sight and drove back to her house. "There's not much else to do except finish the hedges and trim the bushes," she said as she and Arnold got out of the car and she took Kelly's bag from the trunk. "I'll go change while you get the wheelbarrow and the tools we need." Arnold went to the shed to get the equipment and when he had everything ready, Claire came out of the house in a different outfit than what she wore yesterday. The jeans were so faded that they were almost white and her t-shirt was barely down to her stomach and was so baggy that it flopped and fluttered in the light breeze. They went over to the side of the property and for the next few hours, Arnold finished squaring off the hedge on one side of the property. The pile of twigs, branches, and leaves Arnold gathered grew pretty big, and he still had the entire other side of the property to do. Claire told him to make another pile beside it and then took it upon herself to trim the bushes that were spread out across the property and made them look presentable, rather than try to get Arnold to do it. She didn't want to take the chance that she would give him another conundrum that he couldn't figure out if she asked him to make them look good and didn't tell him specifically what to do to make them that way. No wonder Annie had such a hard time with him growing up. Claire thought. "I've only been around him for 2 days and I'm already a little stressed out about taking care of him." She paused in her work and watched Arnold as he paused for a moment to wipe the sweat from his forehead, then he kept working. Look at him go. She thought. He's like a machine. It was then that it clicked for her and her eyes widened at the realization. Oh, my God. Claire stared at the young man in amazement. He's a machine. He needs constant input and directions, or he'll just sit there and idle while he waits for the next direction. Claire's guess was pretty close to the truth. Arnold could function on his own without someone telling him what to do, mainly because he kept to himself and his own interests. He could figure some things out and make the next logical step in most cases as well. It was just so much easier for him when someone told him what to do and he didn't have to try and guess what to do next. Having detailed instructions let his mind take him to the right answer without much guesswork. Let's take a break for lunch, Claire said. Arnold finished a cut on the hedge, cleared the branches and tossed them into the wheelbarrow, then took off his work gloves and walked over to her. She led him in through the back door of the house and into the kitchen again. She gave him the 2 sandwiches left over from yesterday and a bottle of water, and she ate a bowl of rice that was left over from supper the night before. Arnold kept eating and maintained eye contact. Arnold almost instinctively knew that he was in trouble when she asked him if he enjoyed it. Since he was normally mentally stimulated by dissecting specimens and the intricate work it entailed, if he told her that he would enjoy seeing her, it would mean that he wanted to dissect her and look at her insides. Despite that being both interesting and intriguing, Arnold was pretty sure Heather's mother wouldn't like that at all, especially since his biology teacher was right. Most people looked at their work like it was disgusting and avoided it as much as possible. If she ever thought that he considered taking her insides apart and labeling them, it would be very bad for him. No, Mrs. Bradshaw. I didn't look at you like that, Arnold said and saw Claire frown. Why not? Claire asked and tried not to get angry. She had been embarrassed when she stripped in front of him and now he told her that he didn't even like seeing it and it kind of pissed her off. I can't enjoy seeing you like that, because I'm sure you don't want me to, Arnold said and looked down at the counter. I don't want to get in trouble. Claire was a bit taken aback at the admission. Arnold. If you thought I did see you like that, you would hate me for it, Arnold said and looked back at her and right into her eyes. I know you would. Claire let out a long and low sigh as her irrational anger faded away at Arnold's honesty. I think I would. If I knew you only came here to look at me like that, I would be upset about it, she said. I'm sure Heather wouldn't like it either. I know, Arnold said. Then we should never speak of this again, Claire said and leaned forward to put her arms around his head and hugged him to her chest, even though her top was still hanging down off her shoulders. Are you okay? I hope I didn't upset you. I'm okay, Arnold said. They are soft and very warm, Arnold said and saw her face go a little red again. Are you okay? He asked and stood. Your face keeps turning red. I'm fine, Claire said and her face went a little redder. He's calling me out on my embarrassment. It's not sore, is it? Arnold asked and caressed her cheek and felt the heat there. Do you want me to kiss it and make it better? What? Claire asked, then before she knew it, Arnold had given her several soft and tender kisses on both of her cheeks. It's still a little red, Arnold said and repeated the kisses, this time he did twice as many and completely covered her face. Is that better? Why yes, Arnold, Claire said and remembered what he had done to Heather's sore fingers the day before and knew what to say in response. It feels much better. Thank you. Arnold gave her a smile and his handsomeness just seemed to pop into her perception. Claire just couldn't help herself after that little display. I think my lips are a little sore, too, she said and wasn't surprised when he gave her several soft and tender kisses all over her lips. That's great, thank you again, she said. We should get back out there and try to get the hedges done before I have to leave to get Heather and Kelly. Okay. Arnold said and left the kitchen through the back door to get back to work. Claire stood there and watched him put on the gloves and pick up the large hand shears. I think I need to be very careful about what I say, even more than I normally am. She thought, then she wondered if she should discuss the same thing with her daughter. If Heather's not careful. She stopped that thought. No, she wouldn't say things like. She looked at Arnold's arms flex and cut inch-thick branches without pausing. Okay, I think I will have to caution her the next time I can get her alone. Arnold worked for 3 more hours and managed to just get the last of the hedges squared off when it was time for Claire to leave. I'll be back in a little while, Claire said. She had already taken a shower and changed, so she didn't have to worry about asking Arnold to come into the house with her. When you finish cleaning that up and put it in a pile, put everything away and go inside to shower in the spare room like you did yesterday. Okay, Arnold said and kept working while Claire left him alone and went to pick up Heather and Kelly. He took several wheelbarrows full of branches, twigs, and leaves to dump them into the double pile of debris at the back of the property. He finished fairly quickly, since he had a lot of practice doing the same thing for nearly 2 days straight. He took the things he used and wiped them off and put them back in the little shed, then went inside to get a shower. The car pulled in just as Arnold went up the stairs with his bag. Heather and Kelly were pretty loud as they talked animatedly and pretty much stormed into the house. Claire came in behind them and pointed to Kelly's suitcase. Go ahead and take that upstairs, Claire said, and both girls grabbed the bag at the same time, laughed, then lifted it together. For God's sake, don't trip on the stairs. Heather and Kelly kept laughing and ran up the stairs, despite the warning, and rushed into the spare room, then stopped dead as Arnold stood there completely naked in front of them. Hey Arnold, Heather and Kelly said at the same time. Heather was surprised at how good Arnold looked completely naked. She normally didn't appreciate things like that, but this time, his slightly engorged muscles from working so hard were glistening with beads of sweat and her eyes followed several beads as they flowed over his skin. His arms were especially noticeable as the veins were popped a little and showed that he had strained them. Heather's primitive mind leapt to the forefront of her thoughts and all she could think about was staring up at him as he made love to her. Kelly, on the other hand, was completely shocked and only saw one thing. Either fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you looked at it, Arnold was a shower and not a grower. Everything Kelly currently saw was almost exactly what she would see if he was excited, except for where the tip currently pointed and its lack of firmness. I was just going to get a shower, Arnold said and started to turn away. Kiss me, Heather exclaimed, and he turned back and leaned in to give her a kiss. Her hands moved on their own as they rubbed his chest and then moved to his arms as they made out, then one of her hands slid down his abdomen and touched him. His body reacted as she gently stroked him and he became erect for her. She broke the kiss and her eyes were a little wild as she thought about going down on him again. Heather, Kelly exclaimed, and that was enough to bring her back to her senses. Heather looked at her friend and then back at Arnold, while her hand kept slowly stroking him. I think Kelly is starting to see why I like having you as a boyfriend, Arnold, she said and gave him a quick kiss. Kelly's my best friend and I'm very tempted to show her what we did the other day. If you want to, Arnold said, and his hand reached for her crotch to rub it. You need to shower first, Heather said and reluctantly let him go. We'll be in my room. Okay, Arnold said and walked into the bathroom in the spare room. Heather watched him get in the shower, then she took Kelly's hand and led her from the spare room, shut the door, then went to her room across the hall. Heather, Kelly started to say that she had taken her hand with the hand she had stroked Arnold with. Heather let her hand go and sat down on the bed. I want him, Kelly. I want him so bad. Kelly knew the proper response for that statement. Really? I couldn't tell. Heather had wide eyes for a moment, then she laughed and fell backwards onto the bed. She held on to her belly and kept laughing.